Picture the very idea of a king, that singular figure who commands armies, dispenses justice, and is seen as a living link to the divine. It feels like a timeless archetype, a thread woven through the tapestry of human history from ancient Egypt to medieval Europe. But this concept of centralized, hereditary power had to be invented somewhere. It did not simply appear fully formed. Its origins lie not with the famous pharaohs or the later emperors of Rome, but in a far more ancient and often forgotten world, the sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia over 4,000 years ago. There, in a city called Ur, rising from the banks of the Euphrates River, a line of ambitious rulers embarked on a grand experiment in human organization. They were the forgotten kings of Ur, and their innovations would become the fundamental blueprint, the very DNA of ancient power, a genetic code for leadership that would be replicated and adapted for millennia to come. This is the story of how these enigmatic monarchs, whose names are often overshadowed by later giants like Hammurabi of Babylon or Sargon of Akkad, fundamentally shaped the structures of authority we still recognize today. They were the pioneers who first fused political command with religious doctrine, creating the potent idea of the divine right to rule. They built the first sophisticated bureaucracies, with scribes meticulously recording everything from grain taxes to legal disputes on clay tablets. They organized standing armies, commissioned monumental architecture like the Great Ziggurat of Ur, and established law codes that sought to bring order to society. Their strategies for control, for legitimizing their reign, and for managing vast territories were so effective that they became the foundational operating system for every major empire that followed in the ancient Near East. So we are about to journey back to the dawn of civilization itself, to explore a saga of ambition, divinity, and enduring influence. We will uncover how the forgotten kings of Ur laid the groundwork for empires to come, crafting a template of power that echoes, sometimes eerily, in the halls of modern governance and leadership. This is not just a tale of dusty ruins and ancient texts. It is a revelation of how our deepest understandings of authority were forged in the crucible of a lost Sumerian city. Prepare to have your perception of history reshaped as we delve into the legacy of the rulers who first wrote the rules of command. To understand the rise of Ur, we must first step into the world of early Mesopotamia, a land often called the cradle of civilization. Around 2600 BCE, this was a landscape of incredible dynamism and fierce competition. The Fertile Crescent, nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, was not a unified empire but a patchwork of independent city-states, each one a world unto itself. Think of places like Uruk, renowned for its massive walls, or Lagash, a center of artistic and political innovation. These cities were constantly jostling for dominance, vying for control over precious water, fertile land, and lucrative trade routes. It was a world where security was fragile and survival depended on strength, organization, and a decisive leader. This constant pressure, this relentless struggle for resources and influence, created the perfect conditions for a new form of power to emerge, a power that was centralized, authoritative, and absolute. Into this competitive arena stepped the city of Ur. Its location was its first and greatest advantage. Situated near the mouth of the Euphrates River, where the fresh waters met the Persian Gulf, Ur was a natural hub. From its docks, ships could sail south to trade with distant lands like Dilmun, modern-day Bahrain, bringing in exotic goods like copper, pearls, and hardwoods. Overland, caravans would arrive from the north and east, carrying tin essential for bronze and shimmering lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. The city's markets would have been a cacophony of languages and a spectacle of wealth, a place where Mesopotamian grain and textiles were exchanged for the treasures of a wider world. This economic vitality didn't just make Ur rich, it fueled a sophisticated society. Imagine the sights and sounds of this ancient metropolis. Towering above the flat plain was the city's heart, the sacred precinct with the massive stepped pyramid of the Ziggurat under construction, a stairway to the heavens dedicated to the moon god Nana. Around it, workshops hummed with artisans crafting intricate jewelry and fine pottery. Scribes, the administrators of their day, would be busy in courtyards, pressing wedge-shaped marks into soft clay tablets to record everything from temple offerings to business contracts. The streets teemed with priests, merchants, soldiers, and farmers, all part of a complex social machine. But who was in charge of this bustling, ambitious city? In these early days, leadership was evolving. The Sumerians had a term for a powerful leader, the Lugal, which literally translates to big man. This was not yet a king in the hereditary, divine sense we might imagine. Initially, a Lugal was more like a supreme war chief, a prominent figure chosen from among the elders, perhaps for his strength, his charisma, or his success in defending the city from its rivals. His authority was often temporary, tied to a specific crisis. However, in the crucible of constant warfare and economic competition, the role of the Lugal began to change. A successful war leader who could protect the city's wealth and secure its trade routes amassed immense prestige. He could demand loyalty from soldiers and control over resources. Gradually, the temporary big man started to shed his provisional status. His influence expanded from the battlefield into the temples and the courts. He began to mediate disputes, oversee major construction projects, and act as the primary representative of the city to its patron deity. This was the pivotal transformation. The Lugal was evolving from a first among equals into a permanent, overarching ruler. The stage was now set. Ur possessed the wealth, the social complexity, and the strategic imperative for strong, centralized control. The concept of the Lugal provided the prototype. All that was needed was for a powerful individual to seize this moment, to take the raw materials of power, the economic might, the religious authority, the military necessity, and forge them into a new institution, the institution of kingship. This was the monumental change brewing in the air of ancient Ur, a society poised on the brink of inventing a form of rule that would echo for thousands of years. And it was from this crucible of competition that a figure emerged who would permanently alter the political landscape. His name was Mesannepada, and he is often credited as the first true king of Ur's first dynasty, the architect who transformed the idea of a temporary war leader into the enduring institution of hereditary monarchy. While records from his time are sparse, inscriptions and later king lists point to a ruler of extraordinary ambition and vision. Mesannepada understood that for Ur to achieve lasting dominance, it needed more than just a victorious army. It needed a new system of power, one that could outlive any single individual. His strategy was twofold, combining the hard edge of military force with the softer, more persuasive power of diplomacy. He did not simply conquer neighboring city-states like Uruk and Kish through brute strength alone. Instead, he crafted a network of alliances, perhaps sealed by strategic marriages or favorable trade agreements, effectively unifying a significant portion of southern Mesopotamia under his influence. This creation of a sphere of control, a proto-empire, was a revolutionary step. It moved beyond the old pattern of raid and counter-raid. establishing a precedent for a larger, more cohesive political entity governed from a single center, Ur. But Mesanepada's most profound and lasting innovation was something that seems obvious to us today but was radical for its time. He made kingship a family business. He broke decisively with the older Sumerian tradition where leadership could be elective or situational, where a Lugal might be chosen for a specific crisis. Mesannepada established the principle of hereditary succession. The throne would now pass from father to son, creating a dynasty. This was a genius stroke for stabilizing power. It prevented the bloody power struggles that could erupt every time a leader died, ensuring a smooth transition and providing long-term continuity for the state's policies. It created a royal bloodline, a concept that would become sacred across countless cultures for millennia. By embedding leadership within a single family, he gave the state a permanent head, a symbol of unbroken authority that fostered loyalty and order. This simple yet powerful idea that power should be inherited rather than earned became one of the most successfully exported political templates in history, copied by empires from Babylon to Rome and beyond. We get a breathtaking glimpse into the world Mesannepada built not from history books but from the ground itself. In the 1920s, the archaeologist Leonard Woolley made a stunning discovery at Ur, the royal cemetery. While the specific graves of Mesannepada and his immediate successors have been debated, the cemetery dates to his dynasty and vividly illustrates the kind of society he presided over. The treasures unearthed are nothing short of astonishing. Imagine uncovering a queen's tomb like that of Puabi, filled with a fortune in gold, silver, and lapis lazuli. Her headdress was an intricate cascade of golden leaves and rings, and she was accompanied by a retinue of attendants who chose to follow their ruler into the afterlife. There were elaborate musical instruments like the great lyre, adorned with a magnificent golden bull's head. There were chariots, weapons of war, and exquisitely crafted vessels. These were not merely grave goods, they were powerful statements. This incredible concentration of wealth demonstrated the king's control over vast resources and long-distance trade networks. It showed a society with highly specialized artisans capable of producing objects of breathtaking beauty and technical skill. Most importantly, the sheer opulence and the practice of retainer sacrifice signaled a social hierarchy of extreme rigidity, with the king and queen at the very apex, their status so exalted that others would accompany them in death. This is the material proof of the power structure Mesannepada helped create. To solidify this new structure, Mesannepada knew he needed a source of legitimacy that went beyond the battlefield or the council chamber. He turned to the most powerful force in Sumerian life, religion. He forged a powerful alliance with the priesthood of the moon god Nana, Ur's patron deity. Inscriptions tell us that Mesannepada dedicated gifts and built additions to Nana's temple, the Kishnugal. He positioned himself not just as a political ruler, but as the deity's chief representative on earth, the one responsible for maintaining the god's house and ensuring his favor upon the city. This was the birth of a potent fusion, the blending of political and spiritual power. By wrapping himself in the mantle of divine approval, Mesannepada's authority became almost unassailable. To disobey the king was not just a political crime, it risked offending the gods and bringing divine wrath upon the entire community. This partnership was mutually beneficial. The king gained a sacred justification for his rule, while the temple received royal patronage, wealth, and protection. This model of the king as the intermediary between the human and divine realms became another cornerstone of ancient kingship, a hallmark of empires for centuries to come. Through military might, dynastic succession, economic control, and divine sanction, Mesanipada laid a foundation so strong that it would support the weight of empires yet unborn. But the power of a dynasty and a strong army was not enough on its own. To truly command the unwavering loyalty of their people, the kings of Ur needed to tap into a force even more powerful than military might or economic wealth. They needed the authority of the heavens themselves. This brings us to one of their most enduring innovations, the concept of the divine right to rule, a masterstroke of political ideology that transformed the king from a mere mortal leader into the chosen intermediary of the gods. At the heart of this system was the moon god Nana, also known as Sin. He was not just a distant deity, he was the literal divine owner of the city of Ur. The king, therefore, was not the ultimate owner of the land or the people. Instead, he was the steward, the earthly manager appointed by Nana to oversee his divine property. This was a profound distinction. It meant the king's primary duty was to serve the god, and in doing so, he ensured the god's continued favor, which manifested as abundant harvests, victory in war, and general prosperity for everyone. If the king was pious and effective, the city thrived. If disaster struck, it could be interpreted as a failure of the king to properly please Nana. This ideology made the king's position absolutely essential to the community's survival, binding his political success directly to the spiritual and physical well-being of every single person in Ur. This relationship was dramatically enacted and reinforced through elaborate public rituals, none more symbolic than the sacred marriage rite. In this powerful ceremony, the king would not merely pray to the gods, he would temporarily become one. He would embody the figure of Dumuzi, the shepherd god and consort to the goddess Inanna, who represented fertility and life. In a ritualistic union with a high priestess representing Inanna, the king participated in a divine drama meant to ensure the fertility of the land, the animals, and the people. For the population witnessing this, it was not just a pageant, it was a necessary cosmological event. The king's ritual action was believed to directly influence the natural world, guaranteeing the annual renewal of life. This transformed him from an administrator into a vital life-giving force. His body became a channel for divine power, blurring the line between human and celestial. It was the ultimate performance of legitimacy, a yearly reminder that the king's authority was not just sanctioned by the gods, it was, in a very real sense, a part of their eternal order. The propaganda machine of the state worked tirelessly to cement this idea in the public consciousness. Take the Sumerian king list, a fascinating ancient text that blends history with mythology. It presents kingship as a divine institution that was lowered from heaven, and it lists the rulers of various cities, including Ur, often attributing to them reigns of fantastical length, tens of thousands of years. While these numbers are clearly mythical, their purpose was profound. By placing the historical kings of Ur in a direct line of succession that stretched back to a time when gods walked the earth, the text created an unbroken chain of legitimacy. It suggested that the current king's power was part of a timeless, heaven-mandated continuity. Inscriptions commissioned by the kings themselves further hammered this point home. They would often begin with phrases like, "when the gods determined the destinies," establishing that their reign was preordained in the divine plan. Every victory in battle was credited to the personal intervention of Nana. Every building project was framed as an act of devotion to the god. The message was consistent and overwhelming. To challenge the king was to defy the gods themselves. This fusion of religion and politics became an incredibly sophisticated tool for social control. It provided a moral and spiritual framework that justified the social hierarchy. Why was there a small elite class of nobles and priests who lived in luxury? Because the king, as the god's representative, had appointed them to their roles. Why did commoners have to pay taxes and provide labor for the king's massive construction projects? Because this work pleased the gods and ensured the entire community's survival. This system offered a powerful answer to the fundamental question of political philosophy. Why should people obey? The answer was simple and, for its time, virtually unassailable, because the cosmic order demands it. This divine framework created remarkable stability. It discouraged rebellion not just through the threat of royal soldiers, but through the far more potent fear of divine retribution. It fostered a sense of collective identity and purpose, uniting the population under a shared belief system where loyalty to the king was synonymous with piety. The blueprint created in Ur proved to be one of history's most successful exports. The idea of the king as a divine intermediary became the standard operating procedure for legitimizing power across the ancient world. The pharaohs of Egypt would take it a step further, claiming to be living gods incarnate. The later rulers of Babylon and Assyria, while perhaps not claiming full divinity, still insisted they ruled with the exclusive blessing of deities like Marduk and Ashur. Even much later, in medieval Europe, the concept of the divine right of kings echoed this ancient Mesopotamian model, arguing that monarchs derived their authority directly from God and were therefore accountable to no earthly power. The forgotten kings of Ur, in their quest to secure their own throne, had accidentally invented a timeless formula for authority, a formula that would be used to build and justify empires for thousands of years to come. They understood that the most durable power is not just held by force, but is woven into the very fabric of belief, of course. Here is the next segment of the video script. This divine authority and military strength provided the foundation, but to truly govern an expanding domain, the kings of Ur needed something more tangible, something that could translate their will into daily reality across vast distances. They needed an administrative machine, a bureaucracy so sophisticated that its basic principles would feel familiar to any modern government. At the heart of this system was a technology we often take for granted: writing. The Sumerians had already developed cuneiform, the world's first writing system, but the rulers of Ur perfected its use as a tool of power. They transformed these wedge-shaped marks on clay from recording myths and royal praises into the lifeblood of the state. Imagine the scene. In quiet, sunlit courtyards adjacent to the palace and the great temple, dozens of scribes would be hunched over their tablets, styluses in hand, meticulously pressing symbols into the soft clay. They weren't writing poetry, they were creating the first comprehensive databases in human history. Every bushel of barley harvested from the royal fields, every shekel of silver paid in tax, every length of cloth produced in state workshops, every ration of grain distributed to workers, it was all recorded, categorized, and filed away. This relentless record-keeping created an unprecedented level of visibility for the central authority. For the first time, a ruler could know, with a fair degree of accuracy, the wealth and productive capacity of his entire kingdom. He could spot trends, anticipate shortages, and plan large-scale projects with a confidence that was simply impossible before. This was the birth of informed governance, of state planning based on data. To make this vast flow of information meaningful, the kings of Ur implemented another revolutionary idea: standardization. Before their reign, a weight or a measure could vary from one city to the next, even from one merchant to another, leading to confusion, dispute, and fraud. The kings decreed a single, official set of standards that would be used across their territories. They established uniform units for weight, like the shekel and the mina, and for capacity, like the selah for grain. They even standardized the calendar, synchronizing the administrative and religious cycles of the entire state. Now, when an official in a distant province recorded that he had received 100 selahs of grain, the king in Ur knew exactly what that meant. This was a monumental leap for economic stability and trade. It allowed for the fair assessment of taxes, streamlined commerce, and built trust in the system. It meant that resources could be allocated and moved across the empire with incredible efficiency. This concept of state-mandated standards is so fundamental to our world today. From the rules governing our financial markets to the specifications of a USB port, that we barely think about it, but its origins lie in the administrative genius of ancient Ur. The architects and operators of this system were the scribes, a new class of educated elites who became the indispensable backbone of the kingdom. Becoming a scribe was no small feat. It required years of rigorous training in special schools called adubas, or tablet houses. Here, students would spend long days memorizing the hundreds of complex cuneiform signs, learning mathematics, accounting, and the proper forms for drafting everything from a simple receipt to a complex legal contract. This education granted them literacy, a skill that set them apart from the vast majority of the population and gave them access to positions of real influence. Scribes were not just passive recorders, they were managers, accountants, and diplomats. They ran the granaries, supervised labor crews, and served as provincial governors. Their loyalty was to the state bureaucracy itself, which in turn was an extension of the king's authority. By creating this professional administrative class, the kings of Ur ensured that their government could function consistently, regardless of the individual sitting on the throne. The bureaucracy became a self-perpetuating engine of control, binding the empire together with the unbreakable chains of documentation. The depth of their organizational skill is breathtakingly revealed in the thousands of clay tablets that have survived the millennia. These are not grand monuments, but the mundane paperwork of empire, and that is what makes them so invaluable. We have tablets that are essentially payroll records, listing the names of workers, the days they labored on the Great Ziggurat, and the specific rations of barley and oil they received as payment. We have legal documents recording the sale of a house or a dispute over a field boundary, witnessed and sealed by officials. There are ledgers tracking the incoming and outgoing livestock from royal herds down to the last sheep. One fascinating category is the Bala system, a complex rotational tax scheme where different provinces would take turns supplying the central government with goods and labor. The tablets detail which region was responsible for what and when, demonstrating a highly sophisticated method of resource extraction and redistribution. These records show us a state that was deeply involved in the economic life of its people, a state that sought to manage, to plan, and to control on a scale never before attempted. It was this administrative machinery, more than any army, that allowed the kings of Ur to manage their larger domains effectively, creating a template for bureaucratic governance that every subsequent empire would be forced to emulate. Yet for all the power of divine sanction and bureaucratic control, a kingdom's ambitions are ultimately secured by the strength of its arm. The kings of Ur understood that their newfound authority, however well organized and theologically justified, would be meaningless if it could not be defended and expanded by force. To transform their city-state into a true regional power, they developed a military machine whose sophistication would set the standard for warfare in the ancient world. At the core of this machine was the concept of organized professional infantry. This was a radical departure from the earlier model of warfare, which often relied on temporary levies of farmers who would take up arms only during a campaign season. The rulers of Ur began to maintain a core of full-time soldiers, men who trained regularly and were equipped uniformly by the state. These were not part-time militias. They were professional warriors, their loyalty tied directly to the king who supplied their weapons, armor, and rations. Imagine the intimidating sight of these troops marching in disciplined formations, armed with bronze-tipped spears, large rectangular shields that could form a protective wall, and deadly axes. This professional standing army gave the kings a decisive advantage, the ability to respond to threats immediately and to wage war beyond the narrow window of the agricultural year, projecting power with a consistency that their rivals could not match. But the most technologically advanced and psychologically terrifying component of their military was undoubtedly the chariot. The chariots of Ur were not the lightweight, spoked wheel vehicles that would later dominate battlefields in the Bronze Age. These were heavy, four-wheeled platforms, likely drawn by onagers, a type of wild ass. While they may not have been as fast or maneuverable as later designs, their impact was profound. Think of them not as swift cavalry, but as the ancient equivalent of armored personnel carriers or mobile firing platforms. They would have thundered towards enemy lines, carrying a driver and a warrior armed with javelins or a composite bow. The noise, the dust, and the sight of these wheeled vehicles, a relatively new and fearsome technology, would have shattered the morale of less equipped opponents. The famous Standard of Ur, a magnificent mosaic inlay discovered in the royal cemetery, vividly depicts these chariots in action, rolling over defeated enemies in its war panel. This was more than just art. It was propaganda, a celebration of the king's military might, and a clear message to all who saw it. The army of Ur was a force of unstoppable technological superiority. This military power was not just for show. It was actively used in a series of key campaigns to subdue rival city-states and forge an empire. Inscriptions and later records speak of conflicts with powerful neighbors like Uruk and Lagash. These were not mere border skirmishes, they were calculated wars of expansion. The goal was not necessarily to wipe these cities off the map, but to break their independent political will and force them into a subordinate relationship. A victorious king of Ur would not typically install a brutal occupation force. Instead, he would demand a formal oath of loyalty from the defeated ruler and, most importantly, impose a regular tribute. This tribute was the lifeblood of the burgeoning empire. A city like Lagash, renowned for its fertile fields, might be required to send vast quantities of grain to the royal storehouses in Ur. Another region with access to valuable timber or stone would provide building materials for the king's great construction projects. This system allowed Ur to extract wealth from a wide territory without the immense cost of direct, day-to-day administration over every conquered town. It was a pragmatic strategy of control, demonstrating an understanding that economic dominance, enforced by the ever-present threat of military retaliation, could be more effective and stable than pure brute force alone. The archaeological record provides tangible proof of this martial focus. Excavations at Ur itself have revealed not just the splendor of its temples, but the grim reality of its defenses. The city was protected by massive mud brick walls, formidable barriers that spoke to a constant need for security. Within the city, arsenals and barracks have been identified, areas dedicated to the storage of weapons and the housing of troops. But perhaps the most telling finds come from the royal cemetery. The so-called death pits contained not only the remains of court attendants but also soldiers, buried with their copper helmets and their weapons placed neatly beside them. These were the king's personal guard, his elite troops who followed him even in death. Their equipment, the first known examples of metal helmets in Mesopotamia, shows a significant investment in protecting these valuable warriors. Elsewhere, at sites like Tello, ancient Gursu in the territory of Lagash, archaeologists have uncovered caches of sling stones and the remnants of fortified gates, silent witnesses to the fierce battles that raged between these competing powers. This evidence confirms that the kings of Ur were not just builders of ziggurats, They were warlords who invested heavily in both the tools of aggression and the structures of defense. Ultimately, the entire military enterprise served a clear economic purpose. The fertile plains of Sumer were rich in grain, but they lacked the essential raw materials needed for an advanced civilization: metals like copper and tin for bronze, precious stones for religious and elite objects, and timber for construction. The key to obtaining these goods was control over the trade routes that snaked across the ancient Near East. A powerful army allowed the kings of Ur to secure these lifelines. They could protect their own merchant caravans traveling up the Euphrates and intimidate or conquer rival cities that threatened to disrupt the flow of goods. By projecting their power along the riverways and overland routes, they ensured that the tin from Iran, the copper from Oman, and the lapis lazuli from far-off Afghanistan would flow steadily into the markets and workshops of Ur. This martial prowess was the steel fist inside the velvet glove of diplomacy and trade. It guaranteed the economic dominance that funded the grand projects, supported the growing bureaucracy, and sustained the lavish lifestyle of the elite. In doing so, the military strategies of Ur's kings set a definitive precedent. They demonstrated that true, enduring power in the ancient world required the unwavering ability to project force, to secure resources, and to bend the will of neighbors to your own, a lesson that every aspiring empire from Babylon to Rome would take to heart. The military might that secured the borders was only one side of the coin. The true engine of Ur's empire was its astonishing economic power, a system of trade and resource management so advanced that it turned a city-state into the commercial hub of the ancient world. The kings of Ur understood that wealth was not just plunder from conquest, but something that could be cultivated, managed, and multiplied through shrewd control of both local production and international exchange. Their reach was staggering. From the docks of Ur on the Euphrates, ships laden with barley, wool, and fine oil sailed down the Persian Gulf, reaching the distant shores of Dilmun, modern-day Bahrain, which acted as a central trading post. From there, goods traveled even farther. Lapis lazuli, that deep blue stone prized by royalty and priests, made its way from the mines of Afghanistan. Shimmering carnelian and exotic woods arrived from the sophisticated cities of the Indus Valley, like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. To the north and west, overland caravans negotiated with Anatolian merchants for precious tin, an essential component for making bronze, and with communities in the Zagros Mountains for copper. This was not haphazard barter. It was a carefully orchestrated flow of commodities, creating an economic web that connected civilizations thousands of miles apart. The palace kept meticulous records of these transactions, with clay tablets detailing the contents of each shipment, the names of the merchants, and the officials responsible. This was globalization in its earliest form, and the kings of Ur sat at the very center of it. But this international prestige was built on a foundation of local abundance, and that abundance was not left to chance. The fertile soil of Mesopotamia was a gift of the rivers, but it was the massive state-organized irrigation projects that turned that gift into a predictable source of wealth. The kings commissioned and maintained an extensive network of canals, dikes, and reservoirs, channeling the waters of the Euphrates to fields far from the riverbank. This was agricultural engineering on a grand scale, requiring the coordinated labor of thousands of workers directed by royal engineers. The result was a dramatic increase in the yield of staple crops like barley and wheat. This created a consistent agricultural surplus, meaning the society could produce far more food than was needed for its farmers to simply survive. This surplus was the fundamental fuel for everything else. It supported a growing population of non-farmers, the scribes, soldiers, artisans, and priests who formed the backbone of the civilization. More importantly, This surplus grain was collected by the state as a form of tax and stored in massive royal granaries. This stockpiled wealth became the kingdom's primary currency. It was used to pay the workers building the great ziggurat, to feed the standing army, and to fund diplomatic gifts to allied rulers. The ability to manage this agricultural surplus so effectively meant the king could mobilize human labor on an unprecedented scale, turning the collective effort of his people into monumental architecture and military campaigns. The entire economy functioned through a system modern scholars call the palace-temple complex, which acted as the central bank, warehouse, and redistributive agency of the kingdom. The palace, the seat of the king's secular power, and the temple, the house of the god who was the nominal owner of all the land, were not separate entities but two halves of a single economic engine. Farmers would deliver their surplus to the temple or palace storerooms. Artisans, whether weavers, metalworkers, or potters, would receive raw materials like wool, copper, or clay from these central stores and then return their finished products. Scribes recorded every transaction with meticulous detail. This system created a managed, predictable economy. In times of plenty, the central authority could build up reserves. Then, during inevitable lean years caused by drought or flood, the palace and temple could release stored grain to prevent famine, reinforcing the idea that the king's rule was essential for the people's survival. This redistributive model fostered stability and loyalty. It also allowed for incredible specialization, because a skilled bronze smith didn't have to worry about growing his own food. He could perfect his craft, producing weapons and artworks of superior quality that, in turn, enhanced the kingdom's military power and prestige. Our knowledge of this sophisticated economic understanding comes directly from the clay tablets that served as their ledgers and contracts. We have records that function like ancient trade agreements, outlining the terms of exchange between the palace and foreign merchants. Some tablets even hint at the concept of tariffs or import duties, showing an awareness of regulating trade for the state's benefit. One fascinating example is a tablet recording a dispute over the quality of copper delivered by a merchant from Dilmun. The case was brought before a royal official who ruled on the matter, demonstrating that trade was backed by a legal framework that enforced standards and protected interests. Other tablets detail loans issued by the temple, with interest rates calculated in grain or silver, revealing a complex understanding of credit and finance. These are not the scrawlings of a simple barter economy. They reveal a bureaucratic state with a sophisticated grasp of economic principles, supply and demand, quality control, credit, and long-term investment. This economic foundation, built on managed agriculture, controlled trade, and centralized redistribution, was the true source of Ur's enduring strength. It funded the armies that projected their power, it built the ziggurats that proclaimed their divine connection, and it created the wealth that allowed their culture to flourish. Without this deep and resilient economic power, the political and military achievements of the kings of Ur would have been impossible. But a kingdom built on trade, bureaucracy, and military might still require one more crucial element to achieve true stability: the rule of law. For all their administrative genius, the kings of Ur faced a fundamental challenge: how to prevent society from descending into cycles of revenge and chaos, and how to assert their authority as the ultimate source of order. Their revolutionary answer was to take the unwritten customs and arbitrary judgments of the past and carve them into something permanent and transparent. This gave rise to one of humanity's most profound legal innovations, the Code of Ur-Nammu, promulgated by the founder of the third dynasty of Ur around 2100 BCE. This document is staggering not just for its age but for its philosophy. It begins with a prologue establishing King Ur-Nammu as a chosen ruler who eliminated chaos and injustice, setting a tone that law and kingship are inextricably linked. But then it does something remarkable for its time. Unlike the famous "an eye for an eye" principle that would dominate later codes, the laws of Ur-Nammu are primarily based on compensation, not brutal retaliation. If a man accidentally broke another man's foot, he was required to pay a fine of 10 shekels of silver. If he broke a bone with a weapon, the fine was higher, 1 mina of silver. This system of monetary compensation for injuries created a measured, proportional response to wrongdoing. It offered a clear alternative to the unpredictable and often devastating blood feuds that could tear communities apart. By providing a standardized, state-sanctioned path to justice, the code sought to de-escalate conflict and integrate resolution into the fabric of the government itself. The code also reveals a surprising, albeit limited, degree of social conscience, offering protections for some of the most vulnerable members of society. Specific laws were designed to shield widows and orphans from exploitation. There were even statutes concerning slaves who, while considered property, were granted certain legal protections against extreme abuse from masters other than their own. This was not modern equality by any means. The fines and punishments were often tiered based on the social status of the victim, but the very act of codifying these protections was a significant step. It established the principle that everyone, even the powerful, was subject to a public standard of conduct. This had a powerful legitimizing effect on the king's power. By presenting himself as the guarantor of fairness and the protector of the weak, Ur-Nammu's authority was rooted not just in divine right or military strength, but in a perceived commitment to justice. The law code became a tool of propaganda, broadcasting the message that under the king's rule, life was more orderly, predictable, and fair. It gave every subject a vested interest in maintaining the stability of the state, because the state now offered them a tangible form of security. To appreciate the true originality of Ur-Nammu's code, we need to place it next to its most famous successor, the Code of Hammurabi of Babylon, which appeared about 3 centuries later. Hammurabi's code is far more extensive and is often remembered for its harsh, reciprocal justice. If a man puts out the eye of another man, his own eye shall be put out. This principle of lex talionis feels more severe and absolute compared to the compensatory approach of Ur-Nammu. However, the underlying structure is clearly borrowed from the earlier Sumerian model. Both codes use the same if-then conditional format. Both begin with a prologue glorifying the king as a just ruler. Both cover similar areas of life, property rights, family law, and personal injury. The key difference lies in their philosophical emphasis. The Code of Ur-Nammu seems more focused on restoring balance through payment, a system that feels almost pragmatic and economic. Hammurabi's code, by contrast, emphasizes the moral principle of equivalent retribution. This evolution shows how the foundational idea of written law, pioneered in Ur, was adapted and refined by later empires. Hammurabi did not invent the concept of a law code. He stood on the shoulders of the Sumerian kings of Ur, applying their innovation on an even grander scale to manage his own vast Babylonian empire. Of course, a law is only as powerful as its enforcement, and this is where the kings of Ur centralized authority yet again. They appointed judges, often chosen from the ranks of trusted scribes and officials, to preside over legal disputes in courts. This was a decisive move away from justice being administered solely by local elders or temple priests. These royal judges were representatives of the crown, tasked with interpreting the law code and delivering verdicts. Court proceedings would involve hearing testimony from witnesses, examining evidence like contracts written on clay tablets, and then applying the relevant statute from the code. Their judgments were binding and backed by the full power of the state. This created a unified judicial system across the kingdom. A legal case in a distant province would be decided based on the same laws as a case in the capital city of Ur, ensuring a consistency that reinforced the idea of a single, centralized state. The appointment of judges by the king effectively made him the supreme arbiter of justice, the final court of appeal. This judicial centralization was a masterstroke. It prevented local powerful families from twisting the law to their own advantage and gave every citizen, at least in theory, a direct line to the king's justice. It transformed abstract laws into living, breathing authority, touching the lives of ordinary people in the most practical ways, settling boundary disputes, enforcing business contracts, and punishing crimes. This legal framework, combining a written code with a centralized judiciary, did more than just keep the peace. It wove the authority of the king into the very fabric of daily life, making the state an indispensable part of social order. Yet for all the power of laws and ledgers, the most enduring and visible testament to the authority of Ur's kings was not written on clay but raised towards the heavens in towering monuments of mud brick and ambition. Their architectural legacy was far more than mere construction. It was a physical manifestation of their entire philosophy of power, a permanent advertisement of their divine mandate and organizational genius. The crown jewel of this effort, the project that defined their reign for millennia, was the Great Ziggurat of Ur, commissioned by King Ur-Nammu of the Third Dynasty. This structure was not just a temple, it was a deliberate attempt to build a staircase between earth and heaven. Imagine a colossal stepped pyramid, its core made of millions of sun-dried mud bricks, sheathed in a gleaming skin of fired bricks set in waterproof bitumen. It would have risen over 100 feet high, a breathtaking sight on the flat Mesopotamian plain, visible for miles in every direction. At its summit stood the holy sanctuary, the dwelling place of the moon god Nana, a space so sacred that only the highest priests and perhaps the king himself were permitted to enter. For the average person living in Ur, the ziggurat was an ever-present, awe-inspiring reminder of the cosmic order. Its sheer scale communicated an unmistakable message. Only a ruler with the direct favor of the gods could possibly command the resources and labor to create such a thing. It was the ultimate piece of political theology, made not of words but of stone and earth, physically anchoring the king's claim to divine partnership at the very heart of the city. But the king's vision extended far beyond this single, spectacular monument. The city of Ur itself was transformed into a showcase of sophisticated urban planning, a deliberate effort to improve the daily lives of its citizens and, in doing so, secure their loyalty. Unlike the haphazard, organic growth of many ancient settlements, Ur was carefully organized. Its streets were laid out in a recognizable grid pattern, with main thoroughfares wide enough for carts and processions, and smaller, winding lanes leading into residential neighborhoods. This was not an accident, it was the result of centralized planning. Even more impressive were the advancements in public works that demonstrated a concern for health and comfort. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of a complex drainage system, with clay pipes and channels designed to carry waste and rainwater away from homes and streets. In a region prone to flooding, this was a matter of vital importance. The state also oversaw the maintenance of public wells and the construction of robust mud brick walls that protected the city from both invaders and the elements. These improvements in urban infrastructure had a direct and positive impact on living standards, reducing disease and making the city a safer, more pleasant place to live. This was a powerful form of royal propaganda. By providing clean water, effective drainage, and orderly streets, the king could present himself not just as a fearsome warlord or a distant priest-king, but as a benevolent provider, a ruler who used his power for the tangible benefit of his people. This fostered a sense of civic pride and dependency, making the populace more inclined to support the regime that had so clearly invested in their well-being. The ability to execute such grand projects was in itself a staggering display of administrative power. The construction of the Great Ziggurat was not the work of a few hundred people. It was a decades-long enterprise that required the coordinated effort of thousands. Royal administrators had to mobilize and manage a vast workforce. This included skilled artisans, brickmakers, carpenters, and metalworkers, as well as a massive force of unskilled labor, likely drawn from the general population as a form of corvée or labor tax. The logistics were immense. Scribes had to calculate the millions of bricks required, organize the teams to produce them, and plan the complex ramps and levers needed to lift them into place. They had to ensure a constant supply of food and water for the workers, housed in temporary camps near the site. The very act of construction was a continuous demonstration of the state's reach. Every citizen who contributed a day's labor, or who saw the endless streams of workers and materials flowing towards the city center, was receiving a daily lesson in the king's authority. It showed that he could command the time and energy of his entire society and direct it towards a single, monumental goal. This was power made visible and tangible. The ziggurat was not just a symbol of the king's connection to the gods, it was proof of his ability to organize humanity itself on a colossal scale. Ultimately, every brick laid and every street paved served a dual purpose, practical utility and powerful propaganda. These architectural achievements were designed to impress multiple audiences simultaneously. For the local population, the grandeur of the ziggurat and the orderliness of the city reinforced the idea that their king was a legitimate and effective ruler, sanctioned by the gods and dedicated to their welfare. For visiting merchants and diplomats from other city-states, the sight of Ur's imposing walls and monumental architecture was a clear declaration of wealth, stability, and military might. It communicated that this was a kingdom not to be trifled with, a sophisticated power worthy of respect and lucrative trade agreements. Even for rival kings, the scale of construction in Ur sent a threatening message. It demonstrated an unparalleled capacity to mobilize resources, suggesting a treasury overflowing with wealth and a population utterly under the king's control. The architecture was a silent language of power, speaking of divine favor, bureaucratic efficiency, and overwhelming strength. In this way, the kings of Ur used their building projects not just to create a more functional city, but to construct an enduring image of themselves as great builders and divinely appointed leaders, an image so powerful that it continues to shape our understanding of their civilization 4,000 years after the last brick was laid. While the ziggurats and law codes provided the physical and legal framework of the kingdom, the kings of Ur knew that to truly bind the hearts and minds of their people, they needed to craft something more intangible yet equally powerful, a shared cultural identity. They became masterful patrons of the arts and literature, sponsoring a creative explosion that served a brilliant dual purpose. On one hand, it fostered a sense of unified Sumerian identity across their diverse realm, giving people a common heritage to be proud of. On the other, it was a sophisticated propaganda machine, meticulously designed to glorify the reign of the king himself, transforming his mortal achievements into the stuff of legend. This was soft power in its most ancient and effective form, weaving the ruler's image into the very fabric of song, story, and visual art. The most direct tools in this campaign were the royal hymns and epic poems composed by court scribes. Kings like Shulgi of the Third Dynasty were particularly adept at using this medium. We have hymns that praise Shulgi not just as a mighty warrior or a wise administrator, but as a figure of almost superhuman ability. One famous text boasts of his incredible speed, claiming he could run the distance between the great cities of Nippur and Ur, a journey of over 100 miles in a single day. Another celebrates his intellectual prowess, portraying him as a master scribe and a wise scholar. These compositions deliberately blurred the line between historical fact and mythological archetype. By associating the king with the legendary heroes of old, like Gilgamesh, the scribes were elevating him from a mere political leader to a timeless, heroic figure. For the person hearing these hymns recited in a temple courtyard or at a public festival, the message was clear. Their king was not an ordinary man. He was a peer of the gods and heroes, and his reign was a golden age ordained by the heavens themselves. Perhaps no single artifact captures this blend of artistry and political messaging better than the Standard of Ur. This stunning object, discovered in the royal cemetery, is not a standard in the military sense, but a hollow wooden box inlaid with a mosaic of shell, red limestone, and lapis lazuli. Its two main panels, famously known as War and Peace, are masterclasses in visual storytelling. The war side is a dynamic depiction of military might. It shows chariots charging, enemies being trampled underfoot, and soldiers presenting captives to a central, larger figure, the king. He sits majestically, surrounded by his attendants, receiving the spoils of victory. This panel communicates a straightforward message. The king is a victorious leader who protects the kingdom and subdues its foes through overwhelming force. The peace panel, however, is even more insightful. It presents a scene of orderly prosperity. The king, again central but now feasting, is surrounded by courtiers and musicians. Below him, attendants lead bulls and fish, and commoners carry bundles and goods, likely as tribute or for a great banquet. This is the payoff of the war. It shows a society thriving under the king's benevolent rule, where his military success translates directly into economic abundance and cultural celebration. Together, these two panels present a complete narrative of ideal kingship, the power to conquer and the wisdom to create peace and prosperity. It was a portable piece of propaganda, a vivid illustration of the social contract between the king and his people, assuring them that his authority was the direct source of their security and well-being. This flourishing of culture was not left to chance. It was systematically cultivated within the scribble schools, the adabas or tablet houses. These institutions were far more than vocational training centers for bureaucrats. They were the guardians and engines of Sumerian high culture. Here, aspiring scribes did not only learn the technical skills of writing and accounting. They were immersed in a standardized curriculum of literature, copying and reciting the very hymns, epics, and wisdom texts that celebrated the king and the gods. This process was crucial for two reasons. First, it ensured the accurate preservation and dissemination of these texts across generations and throughout the empire. Every graduate of a scribble school carried this state-approved version of culture into their postings as administrators, judges, or priests, reinforcing a consistent ideological message from the capital to the most distant province. Second, and perhaps more importantly, the Adaba created a shared intellectual and cultural identity among the elite. A scribe in the city of Umma would have learned the same stories and hymns as a scribe in Ur. This created a powerful bond, a sense of belonging to a single, sophisticated civilization under the king's rule. They were not just officials, they were custodians of a glorious heritage that centered on the divine authority of the monarchy. By controlling education, the kings of Ur were effectively shaping the worldview of the entire administrative class. ensuring their loyalty was tied not just to a paycheck, but to a cultural ideal that placed the king at its pinnacle. The ultimate goal of all this cultural patronage was to forge a collective identity that transcended local loyalties. Before the rise of powerful dynasties like Ur, a person's primary identity might have been to their city-state, to Uruk or Lagash or Umma. The kings of Ur worked to overlay this with a broader identity, that of a subject of the king of Ur, a participant in a grand Sumerian civilization. The shared stories, the familiar art, the common language of power expressed in hymns and on artifacts like the Standard, all work to create this sense of belonging to something larger. When people across the land heard the same poem praising King Shulgi, or saw depictions of the king as the source of order and abundance, it fostered a cultural unity that made political unity more palatable. This cultural output gave people a reason to be loyal to the throne that went beyond fear of the army or dependence on the bureaucracy. It gave them a shared story, a shared set of symbols, and a shared pride in their civilization. In this way, the arts became a subtle but incredibly strong glue, binding the kingdom together not with laws and soldiers alone, but with the powerful, enduring bonds of a common culture, a culture meticulously crafted to ensure that the legacy of the king would endure for eternity. The era of the Third Dynasty of Ur represents the absolute pinnacle of Sumerian power, a breathtaking culmination of centuries of political evolution. After a period of decline and foreign domination by the Gutians, a new line of kings emerged from Ur around 2100 BCE, not merely to restore the city's former glory, but to forge something entirely unprecedented, a highly centralized, bureaucratic empire that scholars today call the Ur-Roman three-state. This was not just a return to the old ways, it was a revolutionary leap forward in the art of governance. Under visionary rulers like Ur-Nammu and his son Shulgi, the scattered innovations of earlier Lugals were systematically integrated and supercharged, creating an administrative machine of startling efficiency and reach. The state they built was so meticulously organized, its records so vast and detailed, that we know more about the daily workings of the Ur-Roman III Empire than we do about many later civilizations. This period marks the moment when the experimental blueprint of kingship, first drafted by figures like Mesannepada, was finally realized in its most complete and powerful form, establishing a template for empire that would inspire awe and imitation for 1,000 years. The architect of this renaissance was King Ur-Nammu, a figure who seized power with a clear vision of order and centralization. His reign began with a decisive military campaign to drive out the Gutian invaders, but his true legacy lies in the profound reforms he instituted to prevent such chaos from ever happening again. He understood that a kingdom reclaimed by the sword could only be held by a system. His most famous contribution, the law code we discussed, was just one part of a much grander scheme to unify his territories under a single, unassailable authority. But perhaps his most visible and symbolic act was the initiation of an immense building program, crowned by the construction of the great Ziggurat of Ur. This was not merely a religious gesture, it was a statement of intent. Mobilizing the entire kingdom's resources for such a project demonstrated an unprecedented capacity for large-scale organization and sent a clear message to both subjects and rivals. The power of Ur was back, and it was more formidable than ever. Ur-Nammu reorganized the temple economies, standardizing their operations and firmly placing them under royal supervision, ensuring that the vast wealth of the gods was harnessed for the state. He began the process of creating a unified administrative language and set of standards that would allow officials in the capital to manage provinces hundreds of miles away. He laid the groundwork, but it would be his successor who would truly build the empire. That successor was King Shulgi, and his 48-year reign stands as one of the most transformative in all of ancient history. Shulgi was a whirlwind of energy and reform, a ruler who took the foundations laid by his father and constructed an imperial edifice of remarkable complexity. He didn't just rule an empire, he systematized it. A key to this control was the creation of an extensive provincial system. The core of the empire was divided into about 20 provinces, each centered on a major city like Lagash, Umma, or Nippur. To govern these territories, Shulgi did not rely on local, potentially disloyal elites. Instead, he appointed governors known as Ensi, who were directly answerable to the king in Ur. These were often royal relatives or trusted courtiers, their loyalty ensured by their direct connection to the crown. They were not independent rulers, they were middle managers in a vast corporate state, responsible for implementing the king's decrees, collecting taxes, and raising troops. To keep them in check, Shulgi also stationed royal military commanders in the provinces, creating a separation of powers that prevented any single official from becoming too powerful. This network of loyal administrators formed the nervous system of the empire, carrying the king's will to every corner of his domain with remarkable speed and consistency. The sheer scale of the bureaucracy Shulgi created is staggering, and it is thanks to this obsession with record-keeping that we can understand it so well. The palace and temple archives from this period have yielded tens of thousands of clay tablets, creating a paper trail for the entire state economy. We have documents detailing everything from the daily rations of workers building the Ziggurat to the monthly accounts of a provincial governor's estate. This bureaucracy managed a staggering array of state-run workshops for textiles, leather goods, and metals, employing thousands of people. It oversaw massive herds of royal livestock, tracking the birth, death, and shearing of every sheep. It organized a complex system of labor rotation, the Bola tax, where different provinces took turns supplying goods and manpower to the central government. To manage the flow of information, Shulgi established a royal messenger system with way stations along main roads, allowing communication to travel across the empire in a matter of days rather than weeks. This hyper-detailed administration allowed the king to micromanage the economy on a scale that would not be seen again until the Roman Empire. It was a tool of control, yes, but also of incredible efficiency, enabling the state to plan for famine, fund massive projects, and support a large professional army. The ambitions of the Roman three kings were not confined to their own borders. Both Ur-Nammu and Shulgi embarked on ambitious military campaigns to secure their frontiers and expand their influence. Shulgi, in particular, presented himself as a mighty warrior king. His campaigns pushed east into the highlands of Elam, seeking to control the vital trade routes that brought tin and semi-precious stones into Mesopotamia. He led armies north along the Tigris and Euphrates, bringing key cities like Susa under his sway and turning them into vassal states obligated to pay tribute. These military successes were brilliantly propagandized in royal hymns that celebrated Shulgi's personal bravery and martial prowess, creating an image of an invincible leader. But the real purpose of this military expansion was economic. Control over trade routes meant a guaranteed flow of essential resources. Tribute from conquered territories flooded the royal warehouses in Ur with timber, metals, and luxury goods, which could then be redistributed to reward loyal officials, fund building projects, or be traded for other necessities. The military might of the Roman III state was the iron fist that protected and enriched the incredibly sophisticated bureaucratic glove, ensuring that the wealth of an empire continued to flow directly into the hands of the king. This period truly was the zenith, the point at which all the threads of power, religious, administrative, economic, and military, were woven together into a single, formidable tapestry of control. If his father Ur-Nammu laid the foundation of the empire, then King Shulgi was the master architect who built its towering superstructure. His reign of 48 years was not merely a period of rule but a comprehensive revolution in governance, a deliberate and breathtaking project to reshape his entire kingdom into a single, streamlined, and centrally controlled entity. Shulgi understood that a collection of conquered cities held together by force was inherently fragile. His vision was far more ambitious, to weave those disparate territories into a unified empire, bound not just by loyalty to the king, but by the very systems that govern daily life. He launched a series of reforms so profound that they touched every aspect of society, from the marketplace to the battlefield, from the calendar on the wall to the songs on people's lips. His goal was nothing less than the creation of a state that operated with the predictable efficiency of a machine, and in doing so, he crafted a model of imperial management that would be studied and emulated for centuries. The cornerstone of this project was a radical push for standardization. Before Shulgi, the empire was a patchwork of local customs. A merchant traveling from Ur to the city of Umma might find that the local mina weight was slightly different, leading to confusion and disputes. A farmer paying his taxes in one province might use a different measurement for barley than a farmer in another. Shulgi saw this variation as a source of inefficiency and a barrier to true unity. So he decreed a single, official set of standards to be used across the entire realm. He established uniform weights and measures, the shekel, the mina, the selah, that were mass-produced and distributed to officials in every city. Suddenly, a transaction in a distant northern town was conducted with the same certainty as one in the capital. This was a revolutionary leap for economic integration. It eliminated friction in trade, ensured fair and consistent taxation, and allowed the central administration to accurately assess the wealth and resources of the entire empire. He even standardized the calendar, synchronizing the religious festivals and administrative cycles of all the provinces. This created a shared rhythm of life, a collective understanding of time that further reinforced the idea of a single, cohesive state living under one set of rules. To enforce these standards and project power across his vast domains, Shulgi needed to overcome the tyranny of distance. His solution was to build the arteries of empire, a network of maintained roads and a system of way stations known as Dunnu. These were not paved highways in the Roman style, but cleared and leveled routes that were regularly patrolled and kept safe for travel. At regular intervals along these roads, Shulgi established way stations, fortified posts that served as rest stops, supply depots, and communication hubs. Here, the king's messengers, known as Rad Sabum, could swap their tired horses for fresh ones, allowing them to carry dispatches from Ur to the farthest corners of the empire in a matter of days, not weeks. This network was a logistical marvel. It meant that a provincial governor could send a report to the capital and receive orders back with unprecedented speed. More importantly, it allowed for the rapid deployment of troops. Shulgi maintained a core standing army, a professional force loyal directly to the crown, and these roads meant that this army could be rushed to a trouble spot on the frontier long before a local rebellion could gain momentum. The roads and way stations were the nervous system of the empire, and Shulgi was its brain, able to sense what was happening everywhere and respond with incredible speed. This military and administrative machine required a sophisticated operator, and Shulgi invested heavily in the human capital needed to run it. His patronage of education, particularly the scribble schools or adabas, was a strategic masterstroke. These institutions were the training grounds for the empire's bureaucrats, the scribes who would manage the countless records of taxes, rations, and legal contracts. Under Shulgi, the curriculum was standardized, ensuring that a scribe trained in the city of Nippur learned the same formulas, the same accounting methods, and crucially, the same ideological texts as a scribe trained in Ur. This created a unified administrative culture, a shared mindset among the elite that transcended local loyalties. But Shulgi's cultural patronage went far beyond practical training. He commissioned a flood of royal hymns that presented him not just as a king, but as a figure of legendary, almost superhuman qualities. One famous hymn boasts, "I, Shulgi, the mighty king, superior to all. I am a warrior from the womb. I am a powerful lion reared in the midst of wisdom." Another claims he could run the immense distance between Nippur and Ur, a journey of over 100 miles in a single day. These compositions were brilliant propaganda, blending myth and reality to construct an image of the king as the ultimate hero, a mighty warrior, a wise scholar, a swift messenger, and a pious servant of the gods, all rolled into one. For the people hearing these hymns, Shulgi was transformed from a mortal ruler into an indispensable, divine-like force, the very embodiment of the state itself. The sheer ambition of Shulgi's reforms reveals a political genius who understood that power is most durable when it is embedded in the mundane details of everyday life. By standardizing weights and measures, he made the central authority a guarantor of fairness in the marketplace. By building roads and way stations, he made the king's presence felt in the rapid movement of troops and information. By patronizing a unified education and culture, he shaped the worldview of the governing class and the general populace alike. Each reform reinforced the others, creating an interlocking system of control that was both practical and ideological. He didn't just want to rule an empire, he wanted to create a single, integrated organism that could not easily be pulled apart. In this, he succeeded spectacularly. The bureaucratic state he built, with its meticulous records and standardized procedures, was so robust that it allowed him to manage a territory of unprecedented size and complexity. Shulgi's reign represents the ultimate expression of the Sumerian model of kingship, proving that the most enduring power is not merely declared from a throne, but systematically woven into the fabric of weights and measures, roads and schools, and the very stories a people tell about their ruler. Beyond the clash of armies and the meticulous work of scribes, the kings of Ur perfected another, more subtle instrument of power, the art of diplomacy. They understood that an empire could not be built on warfare alone. Lasting influence required a sophisticated toolkit of negotiation, alliance, and cultural exchange. While their armies secured the borders, their diplomats worked to secure something equally vital: stable relationships with powerful neighbors, ensuring the uninterrupted flow of essential resources and creating a buffer zone of friendly states. This was not a world of isolated city-states. It was an increasingly interconnected ancient Near East, and the rulers of Ur proved to be masters of this complex geopolitical chessboard. Their strategies involved a blend of royal marriages, calculated gift-giving, and formal treaties, all meticulously documented on clay tablets that provide us with a remarkable window into the world of Bronze Age statecraft. Through these methods, they projected a form of soft power that complemented their military might, spreading Mesopotamian influence far beyond the reach of their soldiers and weaving a web of dependencies that strengthened their empire from within. One of the most effective tools in their diplomatic arsenal was the strategic marriage alliance. A king of Ur would often seal a pact with a neighboring ruler by marrying one of his daughters into the foreign court. This was far more than a simple political gesture. It was a profound act of statecraft. The princess sent to marry, say, the king of Mari or a high official in Elam, became a permanent living link between the two powers. She would take with her a lavish dowry and a retinue of attendants, but more importantly, she carried the authority and interests of her father. In her new home, she would advocate for Ur's policies, provide intelligence on the local court's mood and intentions, and bear children who would one day rule, their bloodline forever tying their kingdom to the power of Ur. This created bonds of kinship that were considered sacred and carried immense weight. A ruler would be far less likely to attack or betray a kingdom to which he was connected by marriage, as it would be an offense not just against a political entity, but against his own family. These alliances transformed potential adversaries into relatives, creating a network of loyalty that helped to stabilize the volatile frontier regions and secure vital trade routes without the constant need for military intervention. The day-to-day work of maintaining these relationships fell to a professional class of envoys and diplomats, the ancient equivalents of ambassadors. These were highly educated individuals, often scribes who were skilled in languages and the complex etiquette of foreign courts. They would travel back and forth between capitals, carrying messages, negotiating terms, and delivering what were known as greeting gifts. These gifts were a crucial part of diplomatic protocol. A king might send a shipment of fine Babylonian textiles, a chest of silver, or a beautifully crafted weapon to a fellow ruler. This was not bribery. It was a formalized exchange that demonstrated respect, acknowledged status, and reaffirmed the friendship between the two powers. The recipient was expected to respond in kind with gifts of equivalent value, creating a cycle of reciprocal generosity that strengthened the relationship. The archives of Mari, a key city on the Euphrates, are filled with letters detailing these exchanges with the kings of Ur. The tablets reveal a world of careful calculation, where the quality and quantity of gifts were scrutinized for signs of favor or disrespect. This constant communication, managed by trusted envoys, allowed the kings of Ur to stay informed about events hundreds of miles away and to manage their international relations with a deft and informed touch. Our understanding of this sophisticated system comes directly from the thousands of diplomatic letters and treaties preserved on clay tablets. These documents are astonishingly detailed. We have treaties that read like modern contracts, outlining terms of mutual defense, agreements on extradition of fugitives, and promises of non-aggression. The correspondence between kings is often surprisingly personal and candid. In one letter, a king might complain about the poor quality of the gifts he received, while in another, he might urgently request military support against a common enemy. The language used is a fascinating blend of flowery politeness and hard-nosed realpolitik. Kings address each other as brother, a term reserved for rulers of equal status, and their letters are filled with wishes for good health and prosperity. But beneath this veneer of friendship lie clear statements of interest and power. These tablets show that diplomacy was not just about creating peace. It was a continuous negotiation of power, a way to manage rivalries, secure economic advantages, and build coalitions. The very existence of such a detailed paper trail proves that the kings of Ur were not isolated despots but active participants in an international community, using written agreements as a key tool to manage their complex web of alliances. The most critical of these relationships were with the powerful kingdoms on their periphery, particularly Elam to the east and Mari to the west. The relationship with Elam was a constant pendulum swing between cooperation and conflict. The Elamites, based in what is now southwestern Iran, controlled access to vital resources like tin, copper, and precious stones. At times, the kings of Ur pursued diplomacy, establishing trade agreements and even installing puppet rulers in the Elamite city of Susa to ensure a friendly regime. At other times, when diplomacy failed, they resorted to massive military campaigns like those of King Shulgi, to subdue Elam by force and force it into a tributary relationship. The kingdom of Mari, located on the middle Euphrates, was a different kind of partner. It was a wealthy and powerful state in its own right, a crucial gateway for trade with Syria and Anatolia. The kings of Ur treated Mari more as a valued ally than a subordinate. They engaged in frequent gift exchanges and diplomatic marriages, recognizing that a strong, friendly Mari was essential for protecting their western flank and securing the flow of goods like timber and silver. These interactions with Elam and Mari show a nuanced foreign policy. The kings of Ur were pragmatic, using a mixture of coercion and cooperation tailored to the specific threat and opportunity presented by each neighbor. Ultimately, the goal of all this diplomatic activity was to project what we would now call soft power. By establishing themselves as the central node in a network of alliances, the kings of Ur made their culture and their way of life attractive and influential. The very act of sending scribes and diplomats to foreign courts spread the use of the Sumerian language and cuneiform writing. The luxurious gifts they sent, Mesopotamian jewelry, textiles, and carved seals, became status symbols in distant lands, creating a demand for Ur's goods and, by extension, an admiration for its civilization. Rulers who were tied to Ur by treaty and marriage would often adopt Mesopotamian styles of administration, art, and even religion, seeing them as markers of sophistication and power. This cultural influence was a force multiplier. It meant that even in areas they did not directly control, the kings of Ur could shape the political and cultural environment to their advantage. Their diplomatic acumen, therefore, was not a separate endeavor from their military and economic strategies. It was the essential glue that held them all together. It allowed them to secure resources, stabilize their frontiers, and extend their influence, proving that the most enduring empires are built not only on conquest but on the careful, calculated cultivation of relationships. Yet for all the roads, reforms, and diplomatic alliances, the most resilient pillar of the king's authority remained his unique relationship with the divine. The kings of Ur did not merely use religion as a backdrop for their rule. They wielded it as a precise and strategic instrument of control. At the heart of this strategy was the temple, and their approach to these sacred spaces was a masterclass in political calculation. Building a temple was never just an act of piety. It was a highly visible public works project that served multiple purposes at once. When a king like Ur-Nammu commissioned the great Ziggurat, he was simultaneously honoring the moon god Nana, providing employment for thousands of his subjects, and creating an enduring monument to his own power and generosity. The construction site itself became a powerful symbol of a thriving, well-ordered society under a capable leader. By endowing these temples with vast tracts of fertile land, herds of livestock, and dedicated workforces, the king positioned himself as the ultimate pious benefactor, the primary source of wealth and favor for the gods themselves. This generous patronage was a brilliant piece of political theater. It demonstrated to the people that their ruler was not only a powerful warlord, but also a deeply devout man who invested the kingdom's wealth in pleasing the deities who controlled the floods, the harvests, and the very fate of the city. This cultivated an image of benevolent leadership, suggesting that the king's power was ultimately directed toward the collective good, securing divine favor for everyone. But the temple was far more than a symbol. It was an economic powerhouse, a sprawling corporate entity that functioned as a direct extension of the royal administration. The temple estates, often gifted by the king, were some of the most productive agricultural lands in Mesopotamia. They were worked by a combination of priests, full-time employees, and corvée laborers drafted from the general population. The yield from these lands, immense quantities of barley, dates, and wool, did not simply vanish into the inner sanctum. It flowed into massive temple storerooms, which operated as the central banking and redistribution hubs of the kingdom. This temple economy was a closed, highly efficient loop. It produced its own food, crafted its own tools and textiles in dedicated workshops, and supported a large population of dependents, from high priests to lowly laborers. For the king, this system was incredibly advantageous. The temple effectively managed a huge segment of the population and the economy, providing social stability and welfare. During a famine, it was the temple granaries that could release stored food to prevent starvation, an act that reinforced the perception that the king's government, through its partnership with the gods, was the ultimate guarantor of survival. By controlling the temple's resources, either directly or through his appointed overseers, the king harnessed the entire religious apparatus as a tool for economic management and social control. To ensure this symbiotic relationship never tilted in the temple's favor, the kings of Ur exercised careful control over the priesthood itself. The high priests and priestesses who ran the day-to-day operations of the temples were not independent spiritual leaders who might challenge royal authority. They were often members of the royal family or appointed from loyal noble families. A classic example is the powerful office of the Intu priestess of the moon god Nana, a position frequently held by the king's own daughter. By placing a princess in this role, the king created an unbreakable personal link between the palace and the temple. Her loyalty was first and foremost to her father, the king, ensuring that the religious institution would always align with royal policy. This practice of appointing loyalists neutralized the temple as a potential rival power base. It prevented the emergence of a separate priestly class with its own political ambitions, a problem that would plague other ancient societies. The priesthood became, in effect, a branch of the civil service, its leaders owing their position and prestige to the king's favor. This guaranteed that the immense moral and economic influence of the temple would always be used to support the state, preaching obedience to the king as a religious duty and channeling the wealth of the gods to underwrite his projects. The language the kings used in their own inscriptions leaves no doubt about their strategic intentions. When a king commissioned a new temple or restored an old one, he would often erect a foundation stone or a clay cylinder with a dedicatory inscription. These texts always follow a similar pattern. They begin by praising the deity for whom the project was undertaken, but they quickly pivot to glorifying the king himself. A typical inscription might read, "For the god Nana, his beloved lord Ur-Nammu, the mighty man, king of Ur, king of Sumer and Akkad, built his magnificent temple." The message is clear: the god is the recipient, but the king is the actor, the indispensable agent without whom the divine would lack a proper house on earth. These inscriptions meticulously detail the king's accomplishments, how he cleared the land, gathered the materials, and mobilized the workforce. They are less about humble devotion and more about a resume of royal power and piety. By framing every religious act as a personal achievement, the kings ensured that their own legacy was physically built into the very walls of the sanctuaries. Every time a citizen looked upon the great Ziggurat, they were not just seeing the house of Nana, they were seeing a monument to the king who built it, a permanent reminder of his unique role as the god's chief steward on earth. This intricate fusion of temple and palace became a cornerstone of governance, a model so effective that it was exported across the ancient world. The relationship was not one of domination, where the state simply crushed religion, but a sophisticated symbiosis where each institution strengthened the other. The temple provided the king with an unassailable source of legitimacy, wrapping his political decrees in the mantle of divine will. In return, the king provided the temple with protection, wealth, and the political muscle to expand its influence. The temple's economic management freed the royal administration to focus on military and diplomatic affairs, while the king's armies secured the borders that kept the temple's estates safe. This partnership created a stable, self-reinforcing system of power. It meant that rebellion against the king was not just a political crime but a sin against the gods, and that loyalty to the state was synonymous with religious devotion. This model of using religious institutions as political tools, of blending spiritual and temporal authority, became the default setting for nearly every subsequent empire in the region, from Babylon to Assyria. The kings of Ur demonstrated that the most durable throne is one that rests equally on a foundation of law, military might, and the unwavering belief that its occupant holds a sacred, divine mandate to rule. This rigid social pyramid was not an accidental byproduct of civilization. It was a deliberate and carefully engineered structure, meticulously reinforced by the kings of Ur to serve as the bedrock of their authority. At the very apex stood the king, the Lugal, a figure who transcended the hierarchy itself to occupy a unique space between the human and the divine. Just below him was a small, powerful elite class comprised of high-ranking priests, military commanders, provincial governors, and senior scribes. These individuals were often relatives of the royal family or owed their positions directly to the king's favor. Their wealth was immense, derived from generous land grants and their control over the levers of the temple and palace economies. This elite class formed the administrative and military backbone of the state, and their loyalty was secured by the privileges and status that flowed directly from the throne. Their role was to execute the king's will, and in return they enjoyed a life of luxury and influence, living in spacious, multi-room houses in the best neighborhoods of the city, close to the central temples and the palace. Beneath this top tier was a much larger and more diverse group, the commoners, who made up the bulk of the population. This was not a monolithic class but included skilled artisans like metalworkers, weavers, and potters, as well as farmers, merchants, and low-level scribes. They were free citizens who could own property, engage in trade, and seek justice in the courts. However, their lives were heavily burdened by obligations to the state. They were the primary source of tax revenue, required to pay a portion of their harvest or their profits to the central authority. More significantly, they were subject to the corvée labor system, a form of conscripted service that required them to work for the state for a set number of days each year. This was the human engine that built the empire. When you look at the great Ziggurat of Ur, you are not just looking at an architectural marvel. You are seeing the collective labor of thousands of commoners, drafted from their farms and workshops to haul mud bricks and dig canals for the glory of the king and the gods. This system bound every able-bodied subject directly to the state's grand projects, making them active, if unwilling, participants in the glorification of the very hierarchy that constrained them. At the very bottom of this social ladder were the slaves. Slavery in Ur was generally not the brutal, race-based chattel slavery of more recent history. People became slaves primarily through debt. Unable to pay their obligations, they and their families could be forced into servitude or as captives taken in war. Slaves were considered property, but they had some limited rights under laws like the Code of Ur-Nammu. They could engage in small-scale trade on their own behalf, and they could potentially earn or be granted their freedom. Despite these nuances, their existence was one of profound deprivation. They performed the most menial tasks, had no political voice, and lived entirely at the mercy of their owners, who were typically the state, the temple, or wealthy elites. The presence of this enslaved class served as a constant, stark reminder to the commoners of the consequences of failure within the system. It reinforced the idea that social mobility was extremely limited and that security depended on fulfilling one's assigned role. The kings used law and policy as powerful tools to cement this hierarchy into place. The law codes did not seek to create equality. Instead, they explicitly recognized and enforced the different values assigned to human life based on social standing. A famous principle evident in later codes, and likely present in Ur, was that the penalty for harming an elite was far more severe than for harming a commoner or a slave. This legal discrimination sent a clear message. The state valued the lives and well-being of the upper classes more because they were more critical to the functioning of the kingdom. This wasn't just about punishment, it was about defining and protecting the social order. By appointing himself as the ultimate judge and the source of these laws, the king positioned his authority as the essential guarantor of this entire structure. The elite relied on him to protect their privileged status. The commoners looked to him for justice against their neighbors and protection from the powerful, and even slaves could, in theory, appeal to his courts. In this way, every level of society, from top to bottom, had a vested interest in the king's authority, as he was the linchpin holding the entire pyramid together. The stark reality of this social stratification is vividly illustrated by the archaeological record, particularly in the contrasting evidence from burials and housing. The royal cemetery of Ur provides the most dramatic example. The tombs of elites like Queen Puabi were treasure chambers filled with gold, silver, lapis lazuli, and intricate artifacts, accompanied by sacrificial attendants who followed them into the afterlife. This was a staggering display of wealth and status meant to accompany them for eternity. In sharp contrast, the graves of commoners were simple pits in the ground, containing perhaps a single clay pot or a simple piece of jewelry. The difference could not be more pronounced. Similarly, excavations of residential areas in Ur reveal a clear geography of class. The homes of the elite were large, multi-story structures built around central courtyards, with rooms dedicated to different functions and located near the city's center. The houses of commoners were small, cramped, single-story dwellings made of mud brick, often located on narrow, winding alleyways farther from the central precinct. These physical remains, etched into the very soil of the city, tell a silent but powerful story of a society deeply divided by wealth and status, a division that was officially sanctioned and reinforced by royal power. This rigid hierarchy, for all its inherent inequality, was not merely about oppression. It was also a highly effective system for resource allocation and control. By clearly defining the roles and obligations of each class, the state could efficiently mobilize the labor and goods needed for its survival and expansion. The king and the elite directed the economy. The commoners produced the food and goods and provided the brute force labor. The slaves handled the most undesirable tasks. This division of labor allowed for the specialization that fueled Sumerian civilization's artistic and technological achievements. It enabled the state to plan and execute massive projects, from irrigation systems to ziggurats, by knowing exactly what it could demand from its population. The social pyramid functioned like a corporate organizational chart, with the king as the chief executive officer, ensuring that every part of the society was working toward the goals he set. It created a stable, predictable order where everyone knew their place, which, from the perspective of the rulers, minimized conflict and maximized productivity. In the end, the meticulously maintained social hierarchy of Ur was the ultimate tool of royal authority, a human engine designed to convert the collective effort of an entire society into the enduring power and glory of its king. Yet for all its sophisticated bureaucracy, military might, and divine legitimacy, the empire built by the kings of Ur proved to be tragically vulnerable. The very factors that created its strength also contained the seeds of its downfall, a stark reminder that no power structure, no matter how brilliantly conceived, is immune to the converging pressures of a changing world. The collapse was not the result of a single catastrophic event, but a cascade of interconnected crises that overwhelmed the state's ability to respond. A primary and often underestimated factor was environmental. The agricultural surplus that funded the empire was a gift of the rivers, but it was a precarious gift. Paleoclimatological evidence gleaned from ancient soil samples and sediment cores suggests that toward the end of the 3rd millennium BC, Mesopotamia experienced a prolonged period of severe drought. The life-giving waters of the Euphrates dwindled, and the intricate network of canals that fed the fields began to silt up. A hyper-centralized state like Ur was exquisitely sensitive to such a shock. When the central grain stores, the kingdom's primary financial reserve, could not be replenished, the entire economic system began to falter. Famine spread, leading to social unrest and making it difficult to feed the massive labor force and standing army that were the pillars of royal power. The king, who derived his legitimacy from ensuring prosperity, now presided over scarcity, causing a catastrophic erosion of faith in the divine contract that underpinned his rule. This internal weakness created an irresistible opportunity for external enemies. For years, the kings of Ur had managed relations with neighboring peoples through a combination of military campaigns and diplomacy. But now, with the empire struggling to feed its own people, its frontiers became porous and difficult to defend. From the east came the Elamites, a powerful and long-standing rival from the highlands of what is now Iran. They were not nomadic raiders but an organized kingdom with their own ambitions, and they saw Ur's distress as a chance for a decisive strike. From the west and north came pressure from the Amorites, semi-nomadic pastoralist groups whom the Sumerians often dismissed as uncivilized barbarians. As the drought likely affected their own grazing lands, these Amorite tribes began to migrate in larger numbers into the fertile river valleys, settling on the fringes of the empire and gradually undermining its control of the countryside. The Ur-Roman III state found itself caught in a pincer movement, its resources stretched thin trying to confront a conventional military threat from Elam, while simultaneously dealing with the insidious, creeping infiltration of Amorite clans. The very efficiency of its centralized system became a liability. Provincial governors, perhaps feeling abandoned by a capital focused on multiple crises, may have found it increasingly difficult to muster an effective local defense. The final blow fell around 2000 BC. The Elamites, seeing the empire on its knees, launched a direct, devastating invasion. Historical accounts, pieced together from later lamentation texts, describe a brutal sack of the city of Ur itself. The great walls were breached, the temples were plundered of their treasures, and the last king of the dynasty, Ibbi-Sin, was captured and taken back to Elam in chains. The event was so traumatic that it inspired poetic works like the Lament for Ur, which mournfully describes the gods abandoning their ravaged city. The image of the mighty Ziggurat, the symbol of Ur's divine connection, standing silent amidst the smoke and ruins, marked the definitive end of an era. The elaborate bureaucracy collapsed, the trade networks shattered, and the concept of a unified Sumerian and Akkadian empire under the king of Ur vanished from history. The city itself would never again be the seat of a major power, becoming a provincial town in the empires that would follow. The fall of Ur was not just an ending, it was a profound lesson for every subsequent ruler in Mesopotamia. The kings of Babylon and Assyria, who would build their own empires in the centuries that followed, studied Ur's collapse intently and adapted their strategies accordingly. They recognized the vulnerability of an over-centralized state. While they adopted Ur's bureaucratic model, they often allowed for more local autonomy, creating a more flexible system that could better withstand shocks to the center. They learned the critical importance of frontier defense, investing heavily in fortified border cities and more aggressive, forward-deployed military strategies to keep potential invaders like the Elamites and Amorites at bay. Most importantly, they understood that divine legitimacy was a fickle shield. A king could not simply rely on being the favorite of the gods. He had to demonstrate tangible, practical effectiveness in governance, disaster management, and military protection. The ghost of Ur's collapse haunted the ancient Near East, serving as a permanent cautionary tale about the fragility of power and the constant need for rulers to adapt, reinforce their authority, and never take the loyalty of their people or the favor of fortune for granted. The fall of Ur was a seismic event, but the collapse of the city's political power did not mean the erasure of its ideas. In fact, the opposite occurred. The blueprint for kingship perfected by the rulers of Ur was far too effective to be forgotten. It was as if they had written the most successful political software of the ancient world, and after their empire crumbled, every ambitious ruler in Mesopotamia rushed to install a copy. The two most prominent successor states, Babylon and Assyria, did not start from scratch. Instead, they looked to the ruins of Ur as a masterclass in statecraft, adopting, adapting, and often intensifying the models of administration, law, and ideology that had first been pioneered there. This was not a simple case of imitation. It was an evolution where the core principles laid down in Ur became the genetic code for even larger and more powerful empires, proving the incredible durability of the Sumerian template. Perhaps the most direct and famous line of inheritance runs from the law code of Ur-Nammu to the monumental legal achievement of Hammurabi, the great king of Babylon. 3 centuries after Ur-Nammu sought to order to his realm, Hammurabi faced a similar challenge, governing a vast multi-ethnic empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to the heart of Syria. His solution was to create a more comprehensive and publicly displayed version of the same tool. The Code of Hammurabi, famously inscribed on a towering black stone stele, follows the exact structural formula pioneered in Ur. It begins with a prologue that justifies Hammurabi's right to rule as a mandate from the gods, a direct echo of the divine legitimacy claimed by Ur's kings. Where the two codes differ is in their philosophical emphasis. While Ur-Nammu's laws favored monetary compensation, Hammurabi's is renowned for the brutal principle of lex talionis, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. This shift reflects a different societal context. Hammurabi ruled a larger, more diverse, and potentially more volatile empire, and his code's harsh retribution was likely intended as a powerful deterrent. Yet the fundamental concept that a king's authority is demonstrated through the establishment of a universal, written standard of justice was a page taken directly from Ur's playbook. The stele itself, showing Hammurabi receiving the laws from the sun god Shamash, is a powerful piece of propaganda that visually reinforces the same message Ur's kings had promoted. The ruler is the god's chosen agent of order on earth. While Babylon refined Ur's legal and administrative legacy, the Assyrian Empire, with its fearsome reputation for military might, became the heir to Ur's strategies of conquest and control. The Assyrian kings of the first millennium BC took the concept of organized professional warfare to a new level of terrifying efficiency. Their armies, with their iron weapons, sophisticated siege engines, and highly disciplined regiments, were the evolution of the professional infantry and chariot corps first developed in Ur. But the Assyrians understood, just as the kings of Ur had, that military victory was only the first step. To hold a conquered territory, they needed administration. They adopted and expanded the bureaucratic systems of Ur, using cuneiform to keep even more detailed records of tribute, deportations, and resources across an empire that stretched from Egypt to Iran. They also embraced Ur's model of centralization, but with a characteristically Assyrian twist. Rather than relying solely on appointed governors, they frequently uprooted entire populations, deporting them across the empire to break local loyalties and prevent rebellion. This was a darker application of the same principle of control, the state's power to reorganize human lives for its own stability. The architectural language of power also flowed directly from Ur to its successors. The great Ziggurat of Ur did not stand alone for long. In Babylon, King Hammurabi and later Nebuchadnezzar would construct their own massive ziggurats, including the legendary Etemenanki, which some scholars believe inspired the biblical Tower of Babel. These structures served the same dual purpose as they had in Ur. They were centers of religious worship and colossal advertisements of the king's ability to mobilize labor and resources. The Assyrians, though their palaces received more emphasis, also built ziggurats alongside their royal complexes at cities like Khorsabad. The sight of these stepped pyramids rising above the plains would have been a familiar and intimidating one, a visual thread connecting the new empires to the ancient authority of Sumer. It was a way for new rulers to claim a mantle of legitimacy that stretched back to the dawn of civilization itself, embedding their new regimes in a tradition of timeless power. The most profound and enduring export from Ur, however, was not a law, a weapon, or a building technique. It was an idea, the ideology of divine kingship. The notion that the ruler was the intermediary between the gods and humanity, a concept so carefully cultivated by the kings of Ur, became absolutely central to both Babylonian and Assyrian statecraft. The Assyrian kings, in particular, took this to an extreme. In their inscriptions and magnificent palace reliefs, they portrayed themselves not merely as favored by the gods, but as their active, ruthless agents on earth. A famous relief from the palace of Ashurnasirpal II shows the king engaging in a ritual, but his image is merged with that of a winged genie, a supernatural being, symbolically blurring the line between the human king and the divine realm. Their military campaigns were described not as simple acts of conquest but as holy wars, necessary to subdue the enemies of their chief god, Ashur. This was the ultimate adaptation of Ur's strategy. By wrapping their often brutal imperialism in a cloak of divine necessity, the Assyrian kings justified their actions and demanded obedience in a way that echoed, and then amplified, the methods of the forgotten kings of Ur. This continuity is powerfully illustrated by the artifacts and texts that have survived the ages. Cuneiform tablets from Assyrian archives show scribes still studying and copying Sumerian word lists and literary texts 1,000 years after Ur's fall, preserving the language and cultural memory of their predecessors. The very tools of administration, the cylinder seals used to stamp documents, the format of royal inscriptions, the titles of officials, all show a clear lineage. It's as if the operating system developed in Ur was so robust that it continued to run with updates and new versions on the hardware of later empires. The legacy of Ur's kings is therefore not a story of mere influence, but one of direct transmission. They had successfully encoded a set of principles for exercising power that proved to be universally applicable in the ancient Near East. Their innovations in bureaucracy, law, military organization, and royal ideology were not lost in the dust of their fallen city. Instead, they were picked up, studied, and implemented by the next generation of empire builders, ensuring that the DNA of power first sequenced in the city of Ur would continue to replicate for more than 1,000 years, shaping the course of ancient history long. After its creators had faded from memory, for centuries the kings of Ur were little more than phantom names on crumbling clay tablets, figures shrouded in the mists of legend. The grandiose claims of the Sumerian king list, with its rulers reigning for tens of thousands of years, seemed like pure mythology. Then, in the 1920s, the sands of southern Iraq began to yield their secrets, thanks to a joint expedition by the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania, led by the charismatic and meticulous archaeologist Leonard Woolley. His work at the site of Ur would transform our understanding of these forgotten monarchs, moving them from the realm of myth into the clear light of history. Woolley's most stunning achievement was the excavation of the Royal Cemetery, a sprawling graveyard that dated to the heyday of the first dynasty of Ur. As his team dug deeper, they uncovered 16 remarkably rich tombs that they labeled royal, not just for their wealth, but for their horrifying and awe-inspiring contents. These were not simple burials, they were complex death pits where kings and queens were laid to rest, accompanied by a full retinue of their courtiers, soldiers, musicians, and ox-drawn chariots, who had apparently chosen to follow their rulers into the afterlife. This grim practice, known as retainer sacrifice, was a shocking discovery. It provided breathtakingly tangible proof of the king's immense power, a power so absolute that dozens of people would accompany him in death, and of a belief system so strong that such a sacrifice was seen as an honor. The Royal Cemetery was a time capsule, preserving a frozen moment of Sumerian royal authority in all its splendor and brutality. The artifacts lifted from these tombs are among the most magnificent treasures of the ancient world, and they speak volumes about the culture that created them. Take the so-called ram in a thicket, one of a pair of exquisite figures discovered in one of the death pits. It is not a ram at all, but a goat standing on its hind legs, caught in a pose of delicate curiosity as it nibbles on the leaves of a golden tree. The craftsmanship is breathtaking. The body is made of wood covered in gold leaf, its fleece fashioned from carved white shell, and its horns, beard, and the tree's leaves are made of lapis lazuli, a deep blue stone imported from far-off Afghanistan. This single object tells a story of incredible artistry, extensive trade networks, and immense wealth. It wasn't a practical item. It was a piece of high art, a symbol of the natural world, perhaps intended for religious ritual. Then there are the military artifacts like the golden helmet of Mescalamdug, a prince of Ur. Hammered from a single sheet of gold, it is sculpted to look like an elaborate wig, with finely detailed ears and a hairline of delicate rings. It is at once a work of art and a piece of functional military gear, a symbol of the warrior ethos that was central to kingship. But perhaps the most personal artifacts are the cylinder seals. These small, intricately carved stone cylinders were rolled over wet clay to create a unique signature, used to seal documents, storage jars, and doors. The scenes carved on them often show the king in his classic role feasting, battling enemies, or being introduced to a god by a protective goddess. These seals were the ultimate symbols of personal authority, the ancient equivalent of a royal signet ring, and they have been found in the tombs of officials, showing how the king's administration extended its reach even beyond the grave. The impact of these discoveries on our historical understanding cannot be overstated. Before Woolley, scholars had to rely on often fragmentary and later copies of texts. The Royal Cemetery provided a wealth of material evidence that was contemporaneous with the kings themselves. It confirmed the astonishing wealth described in later poems and hymns was not an exaggeration. The lavish use of gold, silver, lapis lazuli, and carnelian proved that Ur was indeed a wealthy hub of international trade, exactly as the text suggested. The presence of sacrificed retainers gave grim, physical proof to the concept of the king's supreme, god-like status that made such a practice conceivable. Furthermore, inscriptions found on seals and artifacts within the tombs helped to correlate the archaeological layers with the names on the Sumerian king list, allowing historians to finally attach specific names like Mescalamdug and Mesannepada to the material culture of their reigns. This bridged a critical gap, turning a list of semi-legendary names into a chronology of actual historical rulers. Archaeology didn't just confirm the historical records, it brought them to life, adding dimensions of experience, the gleam of gold, the horror of the death pits, the skill of the artisans, that texts alone could never convey. Yet, for every question answered, new mysteries emerged, and this is where ongoing archaeological research continues to revolutionize our understanding. Modern techniques are being applied to Woolley's finds with stunning results. Isotopic analysis of the lapis lazuli and carnelian can now trace them back to their specific mines, allowing us to map Ur's trade routes with incredible precision. DNA analysis of the skeletons in the royal cemetery, though challenging after so long, holds the potential to reveal familial relationships between the royals and their attendants, and perhaps even uncover their ethnic origins. Meanwhile, new excavations at Ur and surrounding sites are focusing not on the spectacular tombs of kings, but on the humble houses of commoners. By studying ancient garbage heaps, soil samples, and the remains of everyday pottery, archaeologists are now piecing together what life was like for the ordinary people who built the ziggurats and paid the taxes. This shift in focus is helping us understand the foundation upon which royal power was built: the labor, the resources, and the social structure that allowed such immense wealth and authority to be concentrated at the top. Current research is also re-examining the evidence for climate change, using core samples from nearby marshes to understand the environmental pressures that may have contributed to both Ur's rise and its eventual fall. The work of archaeology, therefore, is never truly finished. Each discovery, from Woolley's spectacular treasures to the modern analysis of a single tooth, adds another piece to the puzzle. These findings are what ultimately bridge the chasm between myth and history. The legendary King Gilgamesh may have been a composite figure, but the golden helmet of Mescalamdug was worn by a real man. The epic tales of wealth and power were not just fantasies, they were reflections of a reality that we can now see and touch in museum cases around the world. Archaeology gives a face and a substance to the forgotten kings of Ur, pulling them from the shadows of poetry and placing them firmly in the world of history. It allows us to stand before the ram in a thicket and not just see a beautiful artifact, but to glimpse the sophisticated, powerful, and complex civilization that created it. A civilization whose legacy was written not only on clay tablets, but in the very earth upon which they built their glorious Chinese letter empire. When we read the Sumerian king list, we are immediately confronted with a profound challenge to our modern sense of history. The text, a crucial document compiled by later Babylonian scribes, presents a sequential record of kingship before the Great Flood, but the numbers it assigns are staggering. The list claims that the very first kings ruled for periods of 28,000, 36,000, or even 43,000 years. To our rational minds, this is clearly impossible. It reads not like a factual chronicle, but like a sacred genealogy, a narrative designed to place the institution of kingship in a timeless, mythical realm that predates the human world as we know it. This is the central puzzle when studying the kings of Ur. The historical record is inextricably woven with threads of pure legend. The same sources that provide us with the names of rulers like Mesannepada and Gilgamesh also imbue them with the aura of demigods and heroes, making the task of separating the man from the myth one of the most fascinating endeavors in modern archaeology. The ancient scribes were not trying to deceive in the way we might think of it today. They were operating with a different purpose. For them, the primary function of a king list was not to provide an accurate year-by-year chronology for future historians, but to establish an unbroken chain of legitimacy, connecting the current ruler on the throne all the way back to the moment when kingship was first lowered from heaven. The fantastical reign lengths were a literary device, a way of expressing the idea that the early rulers existed in a golden age, a time closer to the gods when the normal rules of human mortality did not apply. This blending of myth and history was a feature, not a bug, of their historical tradition. To untangle this knot, scholars have developed a sophisticated toolkit that relies on cross-referencing different types of evidence. The first and most important step is to distinguish between contemporaneous records and later compositions. A clay tablet dating from the actual reign of King Shulgi of Ur, detailing the delivery of sheep to the royal kitchens, is considered a primary source. It was written by a bureaucrat doing his job with no motive to exaggerate for posterity. Its value for establishing factual events is immense. In contrast, the Sumerian king list was written centuries after the fall of Ur, and the epic poems celebrating Gilgamesh were composed and recomposed over a 1,000-year period. These are secondary sources reflecting how later generations remembered and reshaped the past to suit their own cultural and political needs. The second tool is archaeology. The material evidence from excavations acts as a reality check against the textual claims. When the king list names a ruler, archaeologists can look for inscriptions bearing that name on foundation stones, cylinder seals, or votive objects. The discovery of the royal cemetery of Ur by Leonard Woolley was a monumental moment in this process. The incredible wealth buried there, the gold, the lapis lazuli, the evidence of sophisticated craftsmanship, provided tangible proof that the kings of Ur's first dynasty were indeed figures of immense power and wealth, just as the traditions suggested. The archaeology did not confirm the 20,000-year reigns, but it did confirm that these were not mere figments of poetic imagination. They were historical actors who presided over a rich and complex society. A perfect case study of this process is the figure of Gilgamesh. Today, he is world famous as the hero of the great epic, a man who sought immortality, battled monsters, and journeyed to the end of the world. For a long time, scholars debated whether he was a purely mythical invention. Then, archaeological discoveries provided a crucial clue. The Sumerian king list places Gilgamesh as a king of Uruk, who ruled for 126 years, still a mythical lifespan, but a step down from the tens of thousands of years assigned to his predecessors. More importantly, fragmentary inscriptions from later periods have been found that mention Gilgamesh as a historical king, building the walls of Uruk. This suggests a core of historical reality. There likely was a powerful ruler named Gilgamesh in early Mesopotamia around 2600 BC. Over centuries, his memory was transformed. Storytellers and scribes took the historical kernel of a great builder and warrior king and embellished it, adding layers of fantastic adventure and profound philosophical inquiry about life and death. Gilgamesh, the historical king, became Gilgamesh, the legendary hero, because his actual achievements were so impressive that they inspired a mythology. This pattern is a universal one. We see it with King Arthur in Britain, a possible Romano-British war leader who became the central figure of a vast chivalric romance. The historical figure provides a name and a setting, and the collective memory of a people does the rest, enlarging the person to embody their ideals, their fears, and their understanding of heroism. This process of myth-making was often a deliberate political strategy employed by later rulers to legitimize their own power. By connecting their lineage to a legendary past, they could borrow the prestige of semi-divine founders. A new dynasty, perhaps one that came to power through conquest or usurpation, faced a crisis of legitimacy. Why should the people accept this new ruler? One powerful answer was to construct a genealogy that linked the new king back to the great heroes of old. If a Babylonian king could claim descent from Sargon of Akkad or even from the ancient Sumerian kings, it gave his rule a sense of inevitability and timelessness. It planted his authority in a sacred history, making it seem less like a recent political development and more like the restoration of a natural, ancient order. This is why the Sumerian king list was so carefully preserved and copied by later Babylonian scribes. It wasn't just an antique curiosity, it was an active political document. By including the kings of Akkad and Ur in a continuous list that stretched back to the dawn of time, the Babylonian monarchs could present themselves as the rightful heirs to all of Mesopotamian civilization. The myths surrounding earlier kings were not harmless fairy tales, they were ideological tools used to justify the present by carefully narrating the past. The glorification of a Shulgi or a Gilgamesh served to strengthen the institution of kingship itself, for the benefit of every ruler who followed. This critical approach to the sources reveals a much more complex and interesting truth about historical authority. The power of a king was never based solely on his control of armies or taxes. It also depended critically on his command of story. A successful ruler had to control the narrative of his reign, to present himself in a way that compelled obedience and admiration. The kings of Ur were masters of this. The royal hymns composed for Shulgi, which portrayed him as a superhuman athlete and scholar, were early forms of propaganda. The Standard of Ur, with its clear panels of war and peace, was a visual narrative designed to communicate a specific idea of kingship, that the ruler's power brought both victory and prosperity. The mythologizing of earlier figures was part of this same narrative ecosystem. By elevating their predecessors to heroic status, they elevated the very office of the king. This tells us that authority in the ancient world was a delicate combination of tangible force and perceived legitimacy. A king could have the best army in the world, but if his people did not believe in his right to rule, his power would be fragile. The blending of myth and history was not a sign of primitive thinking. It was a sophisticated recognition that power needs a story to sustain it. The forgotten kings of Ur understood that their legacy would be written not just in clay, but in the imaginations of their people, and they worked diligently to ensure that story would be one of divine favor, heroic achievement, and timeless legitimacy. To truly grasp the revolutionary nature of Ur's kingship, we need to step back and view it not in isolation, but as part of a broader tapestry of power emerging across the ancient world. It's a fascinating phenomenon that around the same time the kings of Ur were consolidating their authority along the Euphrates, other great civilizations were undergoing similar transformations in distant river valleys. In Egypt, the pharaohs were building their pyramids along the Nile. In the Indus Valley, a sophisticated but enigmatic culture was flourishing. Each of these societies faced the same fundamental challenge: how to organize large populations in a concentrated space. And each arrived at a similar solution: centralized authority. But they crafted that solution in ways as unique as their environments and beliefs. This comparative lens allows us to see what was truly distinctive about the Sumerian model and appreciate why its particular blend of power would become so influential. The stage for this drama was set by geography. The rise of complex states in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley was no coincidence. It was fundamentally driven by the opportunities and demands of riverine agriculture. These were not gentle streams but life-giving yet unpredictable forces. The Euphrates and Tigris were known for their violent, irregular floods that could wipe out entire settlements without warning. The Nile, by contrast, was far more predictable, flooding with clockwork annual regularity and depositing rich, rejuvenating silt. The Indus River also supported a vast agricultural plain. This environmental pressure created a powerful imperative for collective action. To harness the rivers for irrigation and to protect against their fury required coordination on a massive scale, digging and maintaining canals, building dikes, and storing surplus grain for lean years. This necessity for large-scale, organized labor is what anthropologists call a hydraulic hypothesis. It naturally favored the emergence of a central authority figure or institution that could plan, mobilize, and direct the efforts of thousands of people. The king, or his equivalent, became the indispensable manager of the water and the land, his power growing directly from his role in ensuring the community's survival. So, while the environmental trigger was similar, the specific character of each river, its temperament and challenges shaped the character of the state that emerged on its banks. Nowhere is the difference in royal ideology more striking than when we compare the king of Ur with the pharaoh of Egypt. Both rulers were deeply intertwined with the divine, but the nature of that connection was worlds apart. In Ur, as we've seen, the king was the ensi, the steward and chief administrator for the city's patron god. He was the god's most important employee, their chosen intermediary. He was a mortal who enjoyed divine favor, but a mortal nonetheless. In Egypt, the pharaoh underwent a profound transformation. He was not merely the representative of the gods, he was considered a living god incarnate, the earthly embodiment of the falcon god Horus during his life and becoming one with Osiris in death. This was a qualitative difference in the degree of divinity. The Egyptian state was therefore an absolute theocracy. Every grain of sand in Egypt was considered the pharaoh's personal property, and every official acted as an extension of his divine will. This belief system produced the most iconic symbols of ancient power, the pyramids. These were not just tombs, they were colossal machines designed to facilitate the pharaoh's journey to the afterlife and maintain cosmic order for all of Egypt. While the Ziggurat of Ur was a community temple complex where priests served the god, the pyramid was a solitary gateway for a single divine king. This distinction meant that the pharaoh's authority was, in theory, even more absolute and less dependent on bureaucratic negotiation than that of his Mesopotamian counterparts. This difference in religious ideology had a direct impact on the structure of the state, particularly the development of bureaucracy. The kings of Ur were master bureaucrats out of necessity. Their domain was a collection of formerly independent city-states, each with its own traditions and potential for rebellion. To manage this patchwork empire, they needed a sophisticated administrative class, the scribes, to keep detailed records, standardize measurements, and ensure the smooth flow of taxes and resources from the provinces to the center. The bureaucracy was the glue that held the Mesopotamian empire together. In Old Kingdom Egypt, the situation was different, with the pharaoh's divinity providing a more seamless and universally accepted source of legitimacy, and with Egypt being a more geographically unified and isolated land, the initial need for such a complex secular bureaucracy was less pressing. The Egyptian state was heavily centralized around the pharaoh's court and the vast funerary cults, but the day-to-day administration of the countryside may have been somewhat less intrusive than the meticulous, all-seeing record-keeping of the Ur-Roman three-state. The Mesopotamian model, born from the challenge of integrating diverse peoples, produced a template for imperial management that was inherently more exportable and adaptable to governing large, heterogeneous territories, a lesson later empires would quickly learn. Turning east, we encounter the great mystery of the Indus Valley civilization, a society that presents a fascinating counterpoint to both Mesopotamia and Egypt. Centered around cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, this civilization was remarkably vast and sophisticated, with advanced urban planning featuring standardized bricks, complex water drainage systems, and impressive citadels. Yet, despite this clear evidence of social complexity and central planning, archaeologists have found no clear evidence of a king. There are no grand royal palaces that dwarf other buildings, no elaborate tombs filled with treasure like the royal cemetery of Ur, and no grand statues or inscriptions glorifying individual rulers. Their small, intricate seals depict animals and possibly deities, but not triumphant monarchs trampling their enemies. This has led to much speculation. Did the Indus Valley people have a different form of governance, perhaps rule by a council of elders, or a class of merchant oligarchs who prioritized trade and communal welfare over individual glorification? Maybe their rulers were so thoroughly integrated into a religious system that their power was expressed in ways that are invisible to us, without the need for self-aggrandizing monuments. The stark contrast with Mesopotamia is profound. Ur's legacy is written in the boastful inscriptions of its kings and the treasures buried with them. The Indus Valley's power structure remains silent, suggesting that the path to civilization did not inevitably have to lead through the figure of a single, dominant, self-promoting king. It presents an alternative model, one that highlights the particularity of the Mesopotamian choice. Finally, the military dimension offers another point of contrast. The kings of Ur were, first and foremost, warlords who had evolved into administrators. Their power was built on the professional infantry and the fearsome chariot, and their inscriptions are filled with accounts of battles against rival city-states like Uruk and Lagash. Warfare was a central and celebrated aspect of their rule, a means of securing resources, tribute, and prestige. In Egypt, during the Old Kingdom period contemporary with Ur, the military role of the pharaoh was often more symbolic. The primary image of the pharaoh was as the unifier and sustainer of the land, with its natural borders of deserts and sea providing significant protection. Major external military campaigns were less frequent. The pharaoh's power was demonstrated more through monumental building projects and the control of internal resources than through constant warfare. This is not to say the pharaoh wasn't a warrior. He was always depicted as such in art, but the military imperative was not as relentless as it was in the politically fractured landscape of Mesopotamia, where a rival power was always just beyond the next city's walls. This constant pressure in Sumer forged a kingship that was inherently more militaristic and expansionist, a trait that would be inherited and amplified by later empires like Assyria and Babylon. By placing Ur's innovations side by side with its contemporaries, we see that its greatest contribution was not the invention of kingship itself, but the creation of a specific, powerful formula, a pragmatic blend of divine legitimacy, meticulous bureaucracy, and professional militarism that proved to be the most effective and durable recipe for building and maintaining an empire. Competitive world of the ancient Near East. So we have seen how the kings of Ur rose, ruled, and eventually fell. We have traced their innovations in administration, their military strategies, their legal codes, and their use of religion. But how do we make sense of this sprawling legacy? How do we connect the specific actions of a Sumerian king 4,000 years ago to the vast sweep of history that followed? A powerful way to understand this is through a metaphor, the idea of a DNA of power. Think of it this way: just as biological DNA contains the fundamental instructions for building and operating a living organism, the kings of Ur, through trial and error, encoded a set of core instructions for building and operating a complex state. These were not random inventions, they were a replicable blueprint for centralized authority. And like a successful genetic code, this blueprint proved so effective that it was copied, passed on, and adapted by countless other societies. Its core components, centralization, divine legitimacy, and bureaucracy, becoming the essential building blocks of empire for millennia to come. To appreciate how this transmission works, we can look to theoretical frameworks from political science and history. The great German sociologist Max Weber, writing in the early 20th century, provided a particularly useful lens. He theorized that there are three pure types of legitimate authority, meaning three main reasons why people obey a ruler. The first is traditional authority, where obedience is granted because that's the way it has always been done, like following a hereditary monarch. The second is charismatic authority, based on the extraordinary personal qualities of a leader. And the third, which is most relevant to is legal, rational authority. This is obedience based on a belief in the legality of rules and the right of those elevated by those rules to issue commands. Now, the kings of were operating at the dawn of history, so their power was a potent mixture of all three. Their hereditary dynasties appealed to tradition. Their royal hymns cultivated a larger-than-life, charismatic image, but their most revolutionary and lasting contribution was laying the groundwork for legal, rational authority. By creating written law codes, standardized procedures, and a professional bureaucracy of scribes, they were building a system where power was not just vested in a charismatic individual, but embedded in the office of the king itself and in the impersonal, predictable machinery of the state. This shift from rule by men to rule by law, however imperfect, was a monumental leap. Weber's ideas help us see that Ur's kings were pioneering a form of authority that would eventually become the dominant model for the modern world. The truly fascinating part of this DNA analogy is not just the initial code, but its incredible capacity for mutation and adaptation. The core principles established in were not rigid commands, they were a flexible toolkit. When the Babylonians adopted this toolkit, they kept the centralization and the divine legitimacy but tweaked the legal code, emphasizing harsher retributive justice in the code of Hammurabi to suit their larger, more diverse empire. The Assyrians took the military and bureaucratic elements and amplified them to an extreme, creating a terrifyingly efficient war machine and a system of control through mass deportations. Even much later, the Roman Empire, though developing independently in many ways, ended up with a remarkably similar package: a centralized administration, a state religion that deified emperors, and a sophisticated legal system. In each case, the basic genes of power were present, but they were expressed differently based on the environment. The arid, river-valley context of Mesopotamia required intense central management of water, which favored a strong, bureaucratic state. When these ideas spread to different geographies and cultures, they adapted. The core idea of a king ruling with divine sanction and through an administrative class, however, proved universally appealing because it solved a universal problem: how to maintain order and control over a large group of people. This process of transmission wasn't always a conscious act of copying. Often, it occurred through what historians call diffusion. As merchants traveled along trade routes, they didn't just carry goods, they carried ideas. A Babylonian merchant doing business in Anatolia might bring with him the concept of a written contract enforced by a royal official. A captured scribe from a conquered city might bring his administrative skills to his new master's court, introducing more efficient ways of record-keeping. The very artifacts we've discussed, like cylinder seals or the Standard of were not just objects, they were carriers of a political culture. A neighboring ruler seeing the grandeur of Ziggurat would understand it as a statement of power and might seek to emulate it. In this way, the DNA of power spread almost like a virus, infecting neighboring societies and providing them with a ready-made solution to the challenges of state formation. The model was so successful that it became the default setting for complex society in the region. To not adopt some version of it was to risk being overwhelmed by a neighbor who had. This framework ultimately allows us to see the kings of Ur not as isolated historical figures, but as foundational architects of a political tradition that stretches across thousands of years. Their specific achievements, the Code of Ur-Nammu, the Great Ziggurat, the detailed administrative tablets, are the individual expressions of a deeper, more enduring set of principles. By identifying these principles, we can trace a direct line from the council chambers of ancient Ur to the palaces of Babylon, the forums of Rome, and even discern echoes in the corridors of modern power. The need to legitimize authority, to administer efficiently, and to control resources are perennial challenges of human organization. The forgotten kings of Ur were the first to assemble a comprehensive and replicable answer to these challenges, creating a political genome that would be sequenced and resequenced by every aspiring empire that came after them. Their true legacy is not just in the ruins of their city, but in the very structures of authority that have shaped human history. It is a strange and humbling thought that the ghost of a Sumerian king might be whispering in the ear of a modern prime minister or president. While the golden helmets and ziggurats are gone, the fundamental blueprint for wielding power, first drafted in the dust of Ur, has proven to be one of humanity's most enduring inventions. The echoes of their strategies resonate in the structures of our contemporary world, often in ways we barely stop to consider. Take the very concept of a centralized state bureaucracy. When you file your taxes online, that digital form is the direct descendant of the clay tablet a scribe in Ur used to record a shipment of barley. Our modern governments are vast, impersonal machines run by civil servants, the scribes of today, who operate based on standardized codes and procedures. This legal rational authority, as Max Weber defined it, where we obey the rules rather than the individual, is the ultimate legacy of Ur's administrative revolution. We may not believe our leaders are divinely appointed, but we accept their authority because it is embedded in a system of laws and institutions that promises order and predictability, a direct inheritance from the first bureaucrats who realized that data is control. Perhaps the most striking parallel lies in the use of national mythology and propaganda. The kings of Ur understood that to hold a society together, you need more than laws and soldiers, you need a story. They commissioned hymns and built monuments to glorify their reigns, crafting an image of themselves as heroic, wise, and divinely favored protectors of the people. Fast forward to the modern era, and the tools have simply evolved. Instead of the standard of Ur, we have carefully curated media events and national holidays that celebrate founding fathers and foundational moments. Governments craft narratives of national destiny and exceptionalism, often leveraging mass media to disseminate a unifying ideology that encourages loyalty and discourages dissent. The strategic release of economic data to highlight success, the spectacle of military parades showcasing technological prowess, the leader portrayed as the indispensable guardian of the nation's values, these are all modern iterations of the same ancient playbook. It's the age-old effort to transform political power into a cultural and moral imperative, convincing the populace that the stability and identity of the group are inextricably linked to the current regime. The lessons from Ur's dramatic collapse are perhaps the most urgent for us to consider today. Their empire fell not from a single knockout blow, but from a confluence of pressures: environmental stress in the form of prolonged drought, external invasions by groups like the Elamites, and a creeping internal rigidity that made it impossible to adapt. The centralized system that had been the source of its strength became its greatest weakness when it could no longer respond flexibly to a changing world. We face our own converging crises: climate change, mass migration, and the strain on global institutions. A state that is overly centralized and brittle, unable to devolve power or innovate in the face of unexpected challenges, risks sharing the fate of Ur. Furthermore, the collapse of the divine contract, the loss of public trust when the king could no longer guarantee prosperity, is a powerful warning. Today, legitimacy is derived from a social contract, an implicit agreement that the government will provide security, justice, and economic opportunity. When that contract is perceived as broken, when institutions are seen as corrupt or unresponsive, the foundation of the state begins to crumble, just as it did 4,000 years ago. This historical perspective forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about our own time. Are our leaders perhaps unconsciously replaying the oldest strategies in the book? When we see the rise of populist figures who lean heavily on charismatic authority and cultivate a personal mythology, are we witnessing a throwback to the kind of cult of personality that surrounded Shulgi? When we observe the immense power of massive bureaucratic agencies to collect data and shape daily life, are we seeing the logical endpoint of the administrative state first pioneered in Mesopotamia? The relevance of Ur is not that history repeats itself in a literal sense, but that the underlying dynamics of power, the need for legitimacy, the tools of control, the vulnerabilities of complex systems are timeless. By understanding these patterns, we become more critical citizens, better equipped to recognize the strategies used to secure our compliance, and more aware of the fragile foundations upon which any social order is built. The story of Ur is not a remote archaeological curiosity. It is a mirror held up to our own political moment, revealing the deep and often hidden architecture of authority that shapes our world. For all the incredible detail we now possess about the kings of Ur, thanks to their own meticulous record-keeping, their world remains shrouded in profound and tantalizing mysteries. The very clay tablets that provide so many answers also highlight glaring gaps in our knowledge, leaving us with questions that fuel endless debate and drive archaeologists back into the field year after year. Take the empire's dramatic collapse around 2000 BCE. We can point to a perfect storm of factors: a severe drought suggested by soil samples, the invasion of the Elamites, and the pressure from Amorite migrations. But was it the environmental catastrophe that fatally weakened the state, making it vulnerable to attack, or were internal flaws, like the immense strain of its own over-centralized bureaucracy, already causing the empire to crack under its own weight before any external force arrived? The truth is, we still don't know the precise sequence of events or the relative importance of each cause. It's like trying to diagnose a patient's death from fragmentary symptoms. Was it the final blow from the Elamites that was fatal, or was the kingdom already in terminal decline, its immune system compromised by famine and social unrest? This isn't just an academic puzzle. Understanding the complex interplay of environmental and human factors in Ur's fall offers a crucial case study for the fragility of any complex society, a lesson with unsettling echoes in our own time. The extent of their trade networks is another area ripe for speculation. We know from tablets and artifacts that Ur was a hub, receiving lapis lazuli from Afghanistan and carnelian from the Indus Valley. But the mechanisms of this trade are murky. Were there direct, long-distance voyages by merchants from Ur, brave souls who sailed the Persian Gulf to distant ports? Or was the trade a slow, hand-to-hand relay, with goods passing through a chain of middlemen in places like Dilmun, modern-day Bahrain, each taking a profit along the way? The discovery of a Mesopotamian-style seal in the Indus Valley city of Mohenjo-Daro is electrifying, but it's a single piece of evidence. Did a merchant from Ur set up shop there, or did the seal simply arrive as a curious exotic item? The sheer volume of foreign materials found in Ur suggests a sophisticated and organized system, but its logistics remain one of history's great silent stories. Future discoveries, perhaps the wreck of a Bronze Age trading vessel in the Gulf, could dramatically rewrite our understanding of how globalized this ancient world truly was. Perhaps the most significant silence in the historical record is the voice of the common person. The kings, the priests, and the scribes have told us their stories through inscriptions, hymns, and administrative documents. But what was life like for the farmer who toiled in the fields, the woman who wove textiles in a state workshop, or the laborer who hauled mud bricks for the ziggurat? Their lives are mostly statistical entries in royal ledgers, rations of barley issued, days of labor owed. We know they existed in their thousands, the anonymous foundation upon which the glorious empire was built, but we know very little about their hopes, their beliefs, or their daily struggles. Did they buy into the state propaganda, truly believing in the divine king's benevolence? Or did they grumble under the weight of taxes and corvée labor, harboring a silent resentment toward the elite whose tombs were filled with gold? Archaeology is starting to pierce this veil by excavating the humble residential quarters of cities like Ur, analyzing animal bones and plant remains from garbage heaps to reconstruct diets, and studying the layout of common homes. Each new find helps to populate this vast, silent majority, reminding us that history is not just the story of kings, but of the countless unnamed individuals who made their reigns possible. Ongoing scholarly debates continue to reshape our understanding, proving that history is far from a settled science. For instance, the interpretation of certain laws in the Code of Ur-Nammu is still contested. The fines for injuries are clear, but the social status of the individuals involved is often ambiguous, leading to different readings of how justice was applied across class lines. Even more intriguing is the debate over the role of women. The stunning burial of Queen Puabi, with its clear signs of immense wealth and authority, suggests that women could hold significant power. But was Puabi an extraordinary exception, or were high-status women regularly involved in economics and religion? The office of the high priestess of the moon god Nana was frequently held by a king's daughter, giving her control over a major economic institution. Does this indicate a recognized sphere of female influence, or were these women simply pawns in their father's political games? There are no easy answers, and each new tablet or re-examination of an old artifact can tip the scales of interpretation. This is the thrilling, open-ended nature of archaeology and history. The story of Ur is not a book that has been finished and placed on a shelf. It is a living narrative, with new chapters being written with every excavation season and every technological breakthrough. The use of isotopic analysis to trace the origins of metals, or satellite imagery to identify long-buried canals, is like giving historians a new set of eyes. The unanswered questions are not a failure of the evidence, they are an invitation. They remind us that the past is a foreign country with vast, unexplored territories. They encourage a sense of curiosity, the driving force behind all discovery. The mysteries surrounding the kings of Ur, from the intimate details of a commoner's life to the grand causes of imperial collapse, ensure that this ancient city will continue to captivate and challenge us, its secrets waiting patiently in the earth for the next generation of explorers to uncover. So how did these architects of empire, these rulers who literally wrote the first chapter in the story of centralized power, become little more than a footnote in the popular imagination? It's a perplexing question. While names like Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar are instantly recognizable, the names of Ur-Nammu or Shulgi draw blank stares from all but specialists. The answer lies in a perfect storm of historical circumstance, the quirks of how history gets written, and a deep-seated cultural bias that has long shaped our view of the past. The first and most practical reason is the sheer fragmentation of their own records. The kings of Ur created an empire of clay, not stone. Their meticulously inscribed tablets, while incredibly durable, are also incredibly fragile. When Ur was sacked by the Elamites, thousands of these tablets were baked hard in the fires that consumed the city, which ironically preserved them, but countless others simply crumbled back into the mud from which they were made. Unlike the massive stone obelisks and marble statues of Egypt and Rome, which could stand for millennia as obvious monuments to their builders, the records of Ur were scattered, buried, and silent. The very medium of their greatness was also its greatest vulnerability to being forgotten. For centuries, their history was not so much lost as it was waiting, broken into pieces beneath the shifting sands. This physical disappearance was compounded by a dramatic break in cultural continuity. The world of Mesopotamia was conquered and reconquered over and over again. The Babylonians absorbed the Sumerian legacy, and then the Assyrians conquered the Babylonians. The Persians then swept in, followed by the Greeks under Alexander, and finally the Romans. With each new empire, the older layers of culture were buried, both literally and figuratively. The cuneiform script, the very language of Ur's kings, eventually became a dead language, its meaning lost for nearly 2,000 years. There was no continuous tradition, like the one that passed the stories of Caesar and Augustus down through medieval monasteries and into the Renaissance, to keep the memory of the Sumerian kings alive. Their history was severed, a closed book that no one knew how to read. In contrast, the Greco-Roman world experienced a more direct, if interrupted, line of transmission into the foundation of Western civilization. The works of Greek philosophers and Roman historians were preserved, copied, and rediscovered, becoming the core of the classical education that shaped the minds of European elites for centuries. This educational tradition created a powerful filter, a canon of important history that was overwhelmingly focused on the Mediterranean world, leaving the earlier civilizations of Mesopotamia in the shadows. It was not until the 19th and 20th centuries that the spade of the archaeologist began to reverse this long silence. Figures like Leonard Woolley, with his spectacular excavations at Ur, did more than just unearth treasure. They resurrected an entire civilization from oblivion. The discovery of the royal cemetery with its golden helmets and lyres, and the subsequent decipherment of cuneiform, were revolutionary events. They forced historians to rewrite the timeline of human achievement, pushing the origins of complex society back by thousands of years and inserting the Sumerians and their kings into the narrative. Yet, even with this dramatic revival, the kings of Ur have largely remained confined to academic circles and museum exhibits. They are celebrated as important, but they have not captured the popular imagination in the same way as the pharaohs of Egypt, whose pyramids are global icons. This lingering obscurity points to something deeper than just a lack of information. It points to a persistent cultural bias in how we assign the label of greatness. We often unconsciously measure the past by a set of criteria heavily influenced by the Greco-Roman world. We valorize the lone, charismatic genius, the brilliant military tactician, the founder of a philosophy. Alexander is remembered for his unprecedented conquests and his almost mythical personal drive. Caesar is the paradigm of the political mastermind and the author of his own lucid commentaries. But the greatness of Ur's kings was of a different, perhaps less glamorous kind. Their legacy is not a string of dramatic personal exploits, but the creation of systems, the bureaucratic state, the legal code, the administrative template. It is a greatness of institution building, of anonymous infrastructure. A king like Shulgi is historically significant not because he won a legendary battle, but because he standardized weights and measures across his empire. That's a harder story to tell, one that lacks the clear, hero-centric narrative arc we've been conditioned to appreciate. Our very definition of what makes a historical figure memorable is itself a cultural construct, one that has often sidelined the foundational, systemic innovators in favor of the epic heroes. This invites us to ask a more profound question: who gets to decide what history is worth remembering? For a long time, the answer was largely determined by the West. The academic discipline of history, as it developed in Europe and America, naturally placed its own cultural ancestors, Greece and Rome, at the center of the story. Mesopotamia was often treated as a curious precursor, a prologue to the main event. This is not necessarily a malicious bias, but rather an inherited blind spot, a tendency to view the past through a familiar lens. The result is that entire swaths of human achievement, particularly those outside the direct lineage of Western civilization, have been marginalized. The incredible innovations of the kings of Ur, which influenced every empire that followed them in the Near East, were somehow deemed less essential to a classical education than the Peloponnesian War. This is why seeking out these overlooked stories is so vital. It is an act of intellectual rebalancing, a way of challenging the inherited narrative and creating a more complete, more honest picture of our shared human past. The story of the kings of Ur is not a niche interest for archaeologists. It is a fundamental chapter in the story of power, organization, and civilization itself. By remembering them, we do more than just honor their legacy. We expand our understanding of what history is, and we acknowledge that greatness can wear many different faces. And so our journey to the dawn of kingship brings us to a final, profound realization. The forgotten rulers of Ur were far more than just powerful warlords or pious temple builders. They were history's first great political architects. They looked upon the competitive, fractured world of ancient Sumer and saw the need for a new kind of order, and in response, they engineered a complete operating system for power. They took the raw materials of authority, military force, economic wealth, and religious belief and fused them into a stable, replicable structure. From the divine legitimacy that made the king the god's chief steward, to the bureaucratic machinery that managed an empire with meticulous record-keeping, to the legal codes that substituted compensation for chaotic blood feuds, their innovations became the essential toolkit for any subsequent ruler with imperial ambitions. This was their true legacy, a blueprint, a genetic code of governance whose core sequences centralization, administrative control, and the sanctification of authority would be copied and expressed in empires from Babylon and Assyria to Rome and beyond. This blueprint's endurance is a testament to its sheer effectiveness. The kings of Ur understood a fundamental truth about human societies: that power is most durable when it is woven into the very fabric of daily life. It wasn't enough to command an army, you also had to command the calendar, the weights and measures in the marketplace, and the stories people told about their world. By building the great Ziggurat, they made their divine connection a physical, unavoidable part of the city's skyline. By standardizing the sealer measure of grain, they made the central government the guarantor of fairness in every commercial transaction. By commissioning hymns that praised Shulgi's superhuman speed and wisdom, they embedded the glory of the king into the culture itself. Their genius lay in this holistic approach, creating a self-reinforcing system where the religious justified the political organized the economic, and the economic funded the military, which in turn protected the entire structure. It was a closed loop of control so sophisticated that its basic principles still underpin the organization of modern states, reminding us that when we file a tax return or observe a head of state in a ceremonial role, we are, in some small way, participating in a tradition invented over 4,000 years ago in the dust of Mesopotamia. As we close this chapter, the words of the great Assyriologist Samuel Noah Kramer resonate with a powerful truth. He famously wrote, "History begins at Sumer." This is not merely a statement about chronology. It is an acknowledgement that so many of the fundamental firsts that define civilization, the first schools, the first bicameral Congress, the first moral ideals, the first law codes, emerged from this fertile land. And at the heart of these firsts were the kings of Ur, who took these innovations and scaled them into a model of empire. Their story challenges us to look beyond the traditional narratives of history, to dig deeper than the familiar tales of Greece and Rome, and to recognize the profound debt our modern world owes to these pioneers of power. The story doesn't have to end here. If this glimpse into the world of ancient Mesopotamia has captivated you, I highly encourage you to continue the exploration. Visit the galleries of the British Museum or the Penn Museum, where you can stand in awe before the actual standard of Ur or the intricate ram in a thicket. Pick up a book like The Sumerians by C.J. Gad or Ur of the Chaldees by Leonard Woolley himself to walk alongside the archaeologists who uncovered this lost world. And I would genuinely love to hear your thoughts. In the comments below, tell me which ancient innovation from Ur you find most striking. Do you see echoes of their bureaucratic systems in our modern governments, or perhaps their use of religious ideology in today's political landscapes? What other forgotten rulers or civilizations would you like us to explore next? Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey back through time, to the very crucible where the concept of power was forged. It has been a privilege to unravel this saga with you. Remember, history is not just a list of dates and dead kings. It is the ongoing story of the ideas and institutions that shape our lives, a story that began, in so many ways, with the ambitious rulers of a city called Ur. If this journey into the heart of ancient power has sparked your curiosity, you can help this channel continue to unearth history's greatest mysteries. Liking this video and subscribing with the notification bell is the best way to ensure you don't miss our next deep dive. We have an entire playlist dedicated to ancient civilizations, from the secrets of the Indus Valley to the rise and fall of the Assyrian Empire, waiting for you to explore next. I am incredibly eager to hear which forgotten ruler or lost empire you'd like us to investigate in a future video. Was there a figure from history you've always wondered about? Please share your ideas in the comments below. Your suggestions truly help guide our research and create the content you're most interested in. For those of you ready to embark on your own archaeological adventure, I highly recommend seeking out the artifacts themselves. The British Museum in London and the Penn Museum in Philadelphia house breathtaking collections from Ur, where you can stand face to face with the standard of Ur or the ram in a thicket. For further reading, The Sumerians by C.J. Gad provides a fantastic overview, while Leonard Woolley's own account, Ur of the Chaldees, makes you feel like you're right there with him in the excavation trench. I am deeply grateful for your time and your passion for history. It's your engagement and thoughtful questions that make this a collective exploration, reminding us that the past is not a closed book but a living conversation. Remember, the stories we uncover together don't just teach us about where we've been, They shed light on the hidden forces that continue to shape our world today. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you on our next historical adventure.